Hello, everyone. Firstly, to get the Nathan Nichols out of the way, my buddy Phil. Hello. 500 Nathan Nichols your way, sir. Sandals, 250 Nathan Nichols your way. And Nadimos, I hope that's the right pronunciation, 100 Nathan Nichols for you. Firstly, today's topic. It happened a couple of weeks ago, a debate between Trent Horn, who is a Catholic apologist, and Dyer, who is an Eastern Orthodox apologist / professional conspiracy theorist. And yes, you heard that right. And so I'm going to be reviewing that debate about natural theology, or the role of natural theology for Christians / what kind of apologetics Christians should engage in. And I think it's interesting listening to the two very different approaches. And I don't think that Jay's position is at all representative of Eastern Orthodoxy either. I think Jay's position is representative of a sort of modern fad of, I shouldn't say fad, but a sort of, he's got a following of younger people who are into his particular methodology. But in terms of the Eastern Orthodox, in the wider Eastern Orthodox Church, their view of natural theology is going to be closer to the view that Trent Horn is defending. And just a note about your commentator today, I feel a little bit off. I don't know if some of the mushrooms were gone off in my tea, but I feel a little bit weird right now. So that could be fun if I start throwing up or something halfway through. So yeah, let us begin then. I'll share. I'm not going to play through the whole thing. We're going to skip around a little bit and just listen to some key parts, I think. And I don't want this to go on for ages. I've got a bunch of essays due at the minute. And so today, this is like a bit of a break from all of the stuff that I've got on. I've turned my thingy off. Okay, so let's see.
Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Trent Horn and Jay Dyer, and we are discussing the resolution Christians should read on. But really my goal in this discussion tonight is just
skip
ready.
a bit.
Yeah, one thing I would like to say is just from the outset, thanks to Trent for doing this. And as I was telling Trent beforehand, I've watched several of his debates, at least 3 of them, and I think he's a really skilled debater. And the other thing that I appreciate about Trent is that I think he's a sincere person. And a lot of times in this domain, people...
Something I'm going to start off by saying I find very strange. I mean, I think that it's nice to compliment someone if you sincerely mean it. And I hope that Jay does sincerely mean it. But I think as soon as the disagreement starts happening, I don't know if this is a part of like a moral flaw that Jay has, or immaturity, or, you know, like I don't know what it is, but his actions throughout the debate when disagreement comes up is that he seems to find it very hard to be respectful when he disagrees with someone, and to view the person that he's disagreeing with as if they might have something to offer that he doesn't already know. So he's very, very combative. So I guess I find there to be a bit of a tension, or I'm going to move the mic off to the side a bit so I'm not like my peas aren't popping down as I'm talking. But yeah, I find there to be a little bit of a tension between his sort of opening what's it called, opening compliments to Trent here, and the way he conducts himself. I think if he really did respect Trent, that would probably be borne out in carefully listening to what he had to say and stuff, rather than some of the ways he does conduct himself a bit later on. But that's something that's a belief I formed having watched this before. For you in the audience, maybe I shouldn't have said that at the start to sort of color your views of things.
Probably aren't that sincere, at least not as often as we would hope. But I think that Trent is a sincere guy, so I'm looking forward to a fruitful debate today.
Likewise, Jay. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Well, Jay, whenever you're ready, I'll get the timer going. 15 minutes.
One thing before you start,
yeah.
I would like to add too is that I mentioned to you, Suan, before this that a lot of what we're going to be talking about is going to be pretty dense. So I will be referencing a lot of papers and articles, scholarly essays that Suan has agreed to later tag below. So if I blow past something and you want to look it up later, we do. He does plan to put the references below.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's good to put the references there, but something I'm going to comment on at this stage as well is that so Jay is clearly aware that there's a lot of content that he's trying to communicate across, and I think that given the amount of content that he's trying to fit into his presentation, he has to be aware of that. He is the one presenting it, right? So if you are giving a presentation, any criticism that you receive in the following dialogue and discussion is going to be on the basis of the position that you have articulated. So I don't think you can in the context of having a discussion about a topic where there's disagreement, I don't think you can just offload all of the disagreement onto papers and things that other people have talked about in that context, because the point is that you're there to put forward a case for a position and to discuss it. Now, at this point in the discussion, Jay hasn't done any of that. He's just saying, that stuff's there. But something I have noticed as well that comes out later in the discussion is when there's disagreement over certain things, it'll be, well, it's just this point in the paper. But the point is that Trent isn't here to debate the paper or to offer a review of the paper. He's here to debate Jay, right? And so it's Jay's responsibility to articulate the paper or not lean on it if it contains things he doesn't understand or that aren't reasons for him having the commitment that he has. And the reason that I say that is because we might get into this later, but after this debate, I did talk to Jay, and similarly, he sort of tried to point to me like being incompetent or an idiot or something for not having read the paper, like in terms of that kind of ad hominem. And I said the same thing there, like, well, Jay, I'm talking to you, and the argument that you've put forward, so I'll read the paper some other time, and we can discuss that. And I think that that's a real sort of intellectual vice if you're just going to shift everything off onto something else and not try and engage with people who are critical of your views and help them to understand what it is that you believe.
Yep.
All right, are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right, let me see. Okay. All right, so when it comes to this issue, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of clarity that needs to be made. So first of all, I want to say that I'm not defending a position that there's no such thing as natural law. I'm not defending a position that there's no such thing as moral law. I'm not defending a position that per se there's no such thing as natural theology simpliciter, because it really depends on what we mean by the term natural theology. One of our great theologians in the Orthodox.
See, even in that opening statement, I'm not really sure why. I'm genuinely just not sure why he mentioned natural law or moral law there, because it doesn't seem like they're relevant. That unless he means that those are two things that would be used as parts of arguments within natural theology, and he's not denying them, but he's sort of put them on the same pedestal as natural theology, but it's only natural theology and its purpose that's being discussed. And let's just let it play.
Orthodox Church, soon to be a saint, Father Demetrius Daniloi, wrote in his famous dogmatic work, Orthodox Dogmatics, that for the Orthodox Church, there is no natural theology. And this is because we follow the teaching of St. Maximus when it comes to the Christological character of the created order.
And I mean, this book will be mentioned, but I think Richard Swinburne just recently, I think Richard Swinburne might be Eastern Orthodox. Nobody quote me on that because I could be wrong. But he's at least recently published a volume on the Eastern Orthodox on natural theology in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, And that book talks about, the project of natural theology in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And Duncan Pritchard, who is an epistemologist and a professor at University of California, Irvine, he sent me a reading list of about 200 books that are Eastern Orthodox natural theology books, right? So even if this one person who Jay is quoting says that it doesn't have a place within Eastern Orthodoxy, that's just not borne out by the rest of the tradition.
So in other words, there's a fundamental Christological element to the created order that doesn't allow us to bypass that Christology or that Trinitarian theology to do something like natural theology. So from the outset, Stein Eloy notes that when we look at the natural order and when we do what we might call natural contemplation, the content of the natural order and natural contemplation is the same as the content of Scripture. And in Orthodox theology, in many places, I will show, that is actually the doctrine of the Logi. So although it might sound weird to those that aren't familiar with this doctrine, St. Maximus's doctrine, which is really a logically consistent position of following through many centuries and councils in terms of working out their Christology, Maximus is really the summation of this doctrine of the Logi, and it really is the...
And this is something that's very difficult with Jay's presentation, but listen to the reasons he's actually offering you in favor of his position. So he's just telling you, some guy who potentially you've never heard of before, but maybe you have, says this. The position is logically consistent. Okay, but I think that the position being logically consistent would be like a bare minimum that anyone coming to the discussion would expect of their position. And then the third thing he said is it was in many church councils, but we're not sure, exactly what that means. It was discussed, or it was like a dogma that's put forward. So there's this continuation of history.
The embodiment of Christ, we could say, in the created order, which really comes to fruition after the resurrection and in anticipation of the eschaton. Other Orthodox theologians, for example, continue in this tradition to point out that there's so many problems with the Hellenic idea of natural theology that really undergoes what we might say is a metamorphosis. Father Florovsky.
Okay, so before we go on to the next people, so the reason that's been offered there is he's told you there are many problems with natural theology, so because of something to do with Hellenic culture. Now, is that a good reason for rejecting natural theology? That, or is that literally just a description of the position that he's taking in the discussion, which is natural theology bad? I suppose if you put more weight on like church tradition and history and stuff, then some of the things he's saying could carry some weight. But really, I think as far as I'm concerned so far, he hasn't been offering reasons. And I think that this is a pattern that we'll see continue, is just sort of this mentioning of lots of sort of events from church history, but not actually the provision of any reasons to accept, like not giving reasons that support the conclusion, right?
In his essay, Revelation, Faith, and Philosophy, St. Justin Popovich, in his chapter in Orthodox Faith and Life in Christ, on the epistemology of Isaac the Syrian, notes that this is also in St. Isaac the Syrian an epistemology of the Logi. And so the fundamental issue here is that, as he notes and as Florovsky points out, there's a transformation of the terms and the words that the Hellenic philosophers use. The great convert to Orthodoxy, Yaroslav Pelikan.
So far we have natural theology bad because it's Hellenic, 10 or so names of people who have been committed to this, an epistemology of the Logi, which I've not ever really heard of before. I mean, is it like, I mean, my best guess is that it's something like Augustine's divine illumination epistemology, but I just don't know. So again, no reasons.
Wrote an excellent book that also touches on this topic that I recommend in more detail, where he talks about the metamorphosis of natural theology in the Cappadocians. And of course, the Cappadocians are going to play a huge role in what I'm going to try to get to today. So in other words, what we call the theology of nature or theologizing or reasoning about the natural world is not itself the problem. It's rather the reference of these things. It's rather the grounding of these things in an epistemological sense. And so St. Justin Popovich goes into a great deal to explain that Orthodox gnoseology is unique. And it's unique precisely because it's a different metaphysics.
Again, so I think what he just said there is very confusing as well. So he said it's not that natural theology is the issue. It's the referent of these things that's the issue. Now, I'm not sure what he means by these things when he says that, but I mean, in a trivial sense, the referent of any word that you say is going to be an issue in a philosophical context because, you know, that you're using specific language, and it's likely that that specific language, you know, might go wrong in some way. So in a trivial sense, that's going to be the case. Now, I'm not sure if he means the referent of the premises, or does he mean the referent of the conclusion, which is going to be God? I mean, but I mean, that's of course that's true, that the referent of the thing that you conclude is meant to attach itself to the same object that you're trying to communicate to someone, you know, like I'm not sure why that's an issue. And then the second thing he said, which I think is a separate issue from the referent of the terms being used, is what the epistemology is grounded in, which is just a different story. And again, that's going to be trivially an issue for anyone who's trying to persuade anyone of any position, right? Is going to be, well, have you got good reasons for believing this? And then, you know, maybe certain questions about epistemology, like, well, have I now got good reasons for believing, you know, the testimony that you're delivering to me is true, or that my cognitive faculties are working properly when I perceive the kind of features in nature that you're appealing to, or something like that. So those things, like what our words mean, and whether our cognitive faculties are working properly, or whether it coheres with other belief, whatever epistemic story you're going to tell about our beliefs being justified, it's just going to be a problem for any position anyone's trying to persuade anyone of.
A different anthropology, namely centered around the doctrine of the nous. In Roman Catholic theology, to my knowledge, I don't know of any place where there's an explicit acknowledgement of the doctrine of the nous, or the heart of man, which is the primary organ or faculty for knowing God. The doctrine of the nous will then play a central role in all Orthodox theologians that I'm aware of, in terms of how we would exegete texts like Romans 1 or Psalm 19, which are typically used as texts to prove natural theology in a Thomistic sense. In this context, most Orthodox writers that discuss or exegete the passages, they will actually refer to this in a Christological way, or in a reference to the energies of Christ. So in other words, the heavens declare the glory of God. The glory of God is actually not a creature. In fact, it is a energy that the saints themselves perceive and participate in. The world displays, for example, according to Romans 1, the divine dunamis. The dunamis in the Greek, if you would look to, for example, the famous book by scholar Michael Barnes. Barnes notes in The Power of God in quite a bit of detail that the theology of dunamis in the Cappadocians, and in particular in St. Gregory of Nazianzus, is fundamentally about the potentia that God has, that he doesn't always necessarily actualize. In other words, God does not have to create, for example.
Okay, so I'm trying to think what Jay might mean here. So he's told us the glory of God, the heavens declare the glory of God, which is scripture. And then he's saying the glory of God is not a creature. But I don't think anyone thinks it is a creature. So I'm not sure who that's directed at or why. And then Jay said, so that's an energy of God.
God has, that he doesn't always necessarily actualize. In other words,
God has potency that he doesn't always actualize. Maybe he's just said that. That's not going to go very well with classical theism. But maybe he and Trent just disagree on models of God or something.
God does not have to create, for example, all the possible worlds. He only actualized this world, and he did that on the basis of the logi that he willed to actualize. There's a great paper by Seraphim Hamilton in our Discord rule of faith that I will post below as well about this position and issue with regard to the actualized logé. So in other words, Barnes notes that what is shown in the created order does not exercise, God does not exercise every power necessarily. Another example of this would be when the Son becomes incarnate. There's a kenosis that occurs, right, according to St. Paul in the Philippians. And in this kenosis, the Son becomes a baby, right? He doesn't destroy the world at the same time, for example, as he walks on water. And what this shows us is that we can't have a strict identification thesis doctrine of actus purus, because it would be then impossible for Christ to undergo a kenotic state, enter into a...
So perhaps the reason he mentioned that then before is because he's trying to say God can't be pure actuality, because then Jesus couldn't walk on water and you couldn't have the incarnation and kenosis. But my understanding of the kenosis is that that's more to do with the emptying of God, not so much the powers in walking on water. I'm genuinely just not sure. I mean, there's a lot of high level terminology being put out there, but I can't follow the thread, and I don't think it's because I'm too stupid to. I just think it's not being put forward very well.
A mode of being proper to one hypostasis coming into time and space in a unique mode that the other two hypostases don't do. So in other words, natural theology right away would propose a problem in terms of its actus purus presuppositions in regard...
See, that I don't get what that's got to do with anything. So natural theology poses a problem in terms of its actus purus presuppositions. Why?
regard to the doctrine of the incarnation. For example, in Ed Feser's book, Five Proofs.
Is it because one of Aquinas's 5 ways concludes basically that the thing that is pure actuality, and this all men call God, so that would do away with one of the 5 ways of Aquinas or something, right? But that's got nothing, whether or not one particular argument is sound or not, doesn't have anything to do with whether natural theology in general is a good way of doing apologetics.
Feser literally says in the chapter on the Neoplatonic proof that if this is the case, and he thinks it is a good argument for God, supposedly, then this God cannot enter into time and space, because that would be to undergo change for that God, for that essence, right? But did Dr. Feser not think about the possibility of how that might affect or negate or preclude the doctrine of the incarnation, whereby one hypostasis does enter into the mode of being in time and space? For example, again, the action of creating the world by Christ is distinct from the action of walking on water. And neither of those actions is the same as destroying the world in the conflagration. So all of these things I think are important to keep in mind. There's an essay that I will recommend, a paper by Dr. Bradshaw, where Dr. Bradshaw goes into quite a bit of exegesis in the Old and New Testament about this issue of the energeia.
So still, we've not really had reasons against natural theology in and of itself provided. We've had reasons why arguments that from potentiality to actuality to prove that there must be one pure actual thing, which people call God, are unsound, which is just one particular argument or maybe class of arguments. We've had Ed Feser can't account for the incarnation. Okay. And a few people disagreed with natural theology who you might not have heard of before.
And then being really distinct in multiple scriptural passages. So the energies doctrine is not grounded in the Cappadocians or in Palamos. It's actually grounded in the New Testament, Old Testament theology itself, particularly Paul's epistles, where he talks about the energeia. Trent's position, as I've heard it outlined in multiple debates, including with Ben Watkins, is what I would classify, not with the intention of mischaracterizing him. He can freely correct me at any point if he thinks I've misread him. Is something akin to a classical foundationalist approach. In the classical foundationalist approach, especially in the Matt Dillahunty debate, we see a basic empiricist narrative that the classic Aristotelian type arguments for change, act, potency. The problem here is that these all contain tremendous metaphysical baggage. God just is unlimited being itself, he says. God is not composed. God is not in time and space. The observations of the world around us through just observing sense data then can lead.
I think I'd agree that they're all metaphysical baggage, but I'm not sure that, I mean, I'm not really 100% sure what Jay has been saying, but it seems to me that everything that he has said has also had quite a lot of metaphysical baggage, like this distinction between essences and energies and stuff like that. I mean, most ordinary people aren't going to understand most of that, or, like even have that kind of terminology in the sense Jay means it in their sort of vernacular.
Lead us to this supposed conclusions about this deity. He even says this is a first actualizer with no potentia, etc. This has, of course, been subject to many, many, many examples of critique in the academic literature, particularly regarding the not just modal collapse, but also what's called the identity thesis. Radegawitz's famous PhD thesis on this goes into great detail to show that, in fact, the Roman Catholic doctrine of identity thesis is really part and parcel, especially in Aquinas, with what we see in Eunomius. And in fact, Basil's arguments against Eunomius are quite the contrary to what we might expect, right? Basil does not accept the Eunomian or Neoplatonic definition of simplicity, which underlies the very doctrine that I've heard Trent outline. Now, the eternal actualizer point is actually ridiculed by St. Basil in Hexameron 2, where Basil says that if it's the case that God is an eternal actualizer, then it stands to reason, like Aristotle thought, that there's also an eternal world that he actualizes. For him to have any meaning as eternal actualizer requires an eternal other than himself for him to perpetually move and actualize. This, in fact, is why Phaser himself has given up the project of using this line of causal chains or reasoning back to a first cause, as if you could prove or demonstrate creation as.
So, again, it just seems like Jay has issues with Aristotelian metaphysics of potentiality and actuality, but he's not the only Christian in that camp. And the topic of the debate is whether or not people should engage in natural theology, not whether a particular Aristotelian or Thomistic conception of theism is true, or whether there are sound arguments within that system.
As a specific ex nihilo action. In fact, Phaser just submits and says, we can't do that. It doesn't work. In fact, the problem at root here really isn't about that. It's about the meaning of the term and usage of the classical theistic attributes. The problem is outlined in the paper that I would recommend, Dr. Garaby's paper, which goes into great detail in demonstrating logically and formally the actual fallacies involved in theistic in the idea of a generic theism, the idea that natural theology can actually arise to on the basis of theory-neutral predicates, theory-neutral attributes, the omniscience, omnipresence, eternality, freedom, goodness, creator status, sustaining status, and personal status of this deity, as well as, according to, for example, Swinburne, as a typical Thomist, that this deity is also deserves reverence and worship. This deity also is the same in all the monotheistic religions because they have similar predicates. This is, of course, a fallacy. The fact that these different religious systems have similar predicates for the deity, it does not follow logically that they are referring to the same deity. But this is, in fact, what underlies all natural.
Okay, that sentence there helps with something that he says later, which I think is very unhelpful. Well, actually, I'm not sure that it does help with what he's saying later. But a big part of this argument, a big thing Jay focuses on, I'm not sure if it's a part of the argument because I'm not sure what the argument is against natural theology. But one of the things that he's concerned about is that people are reaching conclusions where by the term God, right, they mean different things. Now, the way I would articulate that is just that people can equivocate on the term, or people can mean the same thing in different senses. Now, Jay introduces the notion of rigid designators, which I think he uses inappropriately. But I think I'm understanding what is being said there, because I think the idea is going to be that people are using people are reaching these conceptions of God in all of these independent traditions, right? And they attribute these properties to this thing, and then he's going to say something like, but those properties are being named in intentional context or something, so you can't do this thing called expectation on them and interchange them or something like that. I mean, I'm not really sure why that's relevant or offers more than just saying that they're using the word in a different sense, or they have something else in mind when they say that. But
natural theological argumentation about the Abrahamic monotheistic faiths. And in fact, I've heard Trent argue many times that the Abrahamic or monotheistic religion is a common core generic type of theism that we see in these authors. For example, it doesn't work to say that all the predicates are referring to the same referent merely because they have different, again, because they have different systems, because I can give you multiple examples, such as the quantifier shift fallacy, where, for example, if we were looking at the fact that because monotheistic religions all claim to believe in one God, it does not follow logically that they believe in or refer to the same God. Again, that is the quantifier shift fallacy.
he's saying the sentence, all monotheistic religions believe in one God, is not the same as the sentence, there is one God that's believed in by all monotheistic religions. I agree with that, but that is a different thing from whether or not these predicates all denote the same object. And I mean, if someone's committed to the identity of indiscernibles, the indiscernibility of identicals, which way around is it? Yeah, identity of indiscernibles, or Leibniz's law, then if any two things share all the same properties, right, then they are going to be identical. So I think so if people are coming up with all of the same properties through natural theology in these different traditions, I think that would be pretty good evidence that they are actually denoting the same thing. But then when Jay says, well, no, they're not, I think then he's going to have to say, well, when, you know, what they mean by this metaphysical concept is just different, and then it's going to just fall back into equivocation. So I'm not sure, you know, then the complaint is just going to be equivocation on a term where it's meant in a different sense. So it just seems like introducing overly complex terminology where it needn't be introduced.
Fallacy. We can think of examples like every girl loves one boy, therefore every girl loves the same boy, or every person is born of a woman, therefore every person is born of the same woman. It's an obvious fallacy and doesn't logically follow. This also relates to the what in
and it's sort of irrelevant to point that out unless that is an argument that's a part of Trent's case. I don't think that Trent makes the case that all monotheistic religions worship a god, therefore there's a god worshipped by all monotheistic religions. So it's just a sort of irrelevant thing to mention, really. And I'm still not sure what Jay's actual argument is against natural theology at this point, you know, 10 or so minutes into his opening.
Linguistic philosophy or logic is called the non-substitutivity of identicals in linguistic intentional context, right? So in other words, we can't just substitute words.
But in an intentional context, in a sentence would be to say something like, I don't know, John believes that, you know, John believes that Hesperus is a planet or something, right? That's an intentional context. But if the context is just Hesperus is a planet, that's an extensional context. So, I mean, Jay's not pointed out why the notion of an intentional context here is actually relevant to what's being to the argument at all. I don't understand. I mean, yeah, I don't get it. Like, why is it relevant?
Words as if they mean the same thing, because they even if they might refer to the same thing. So, for example, we could think of an example where I list to you, I'm thinking of a man who is a famous Greek, a famous lover and promoter of philosophy, a very wealthy patrician, and his name is Aristotle. Now, we might both intend to have the same referent, but in fact, we aren't thinking of the same thing, because I might be thinking of Aristotle, the philosopher in the ancient world. You might be thinking of Aristotle Onassis, the famous billionaire of recent memory. These are good examples, as well as something like We could give another example, such as the one true God is the Trinity. Aristotle believed in one God, therefore Aristotle believed in the Trinity. Well, obviously that's not true. No one would accept that. And what that shows is that you can't substitute the identity of identical words.
Right. In intentional context, but why is that relevant? Because is Trent doing that?
Without looking at the intentional epistemic context. And this is, again, just another problem that plagues the the assumptions of basic generic theism. The other problem, of course, is that it ought to lead to perennialism. If there's a common core religion, which is actually the presupposition of natural theology in terms of its monotheistic predicates, then we are bypassing the Trinity, and we're actually arguing for something other than the content of the systems of Judaism, Christianity.
Sorry, why is perennialism inconsistent with Trinitarian monotheism? That is also, not really established here, because I think they are. I think perennialism's a kind of pluralism that you can hold to, and still be a Trinitarian Christian monotheist.
And Islam. So in other words, it would be a fourth core position that is the real position, distinct from the other three. And in fact, as we saw in the Swinburne example of the attributes, one of those attributes he lists is that we should obey God. Well, the obedience required to God is mutually exclusive in these different systems. So in Islam, a Muslim doesn't allow that you can obey the same God in the same way in Christianity, even though they might say or believe falsely.
Okay, so the argument now is people in different religions believe different things are required, so it can't be the same God behind each religion.
That we have the same God. In fact, I could just simply refer to Jesus's explication of this notion in the New Testament, when from John 5 to John 9, this very question comes up, where Jesus says that even if you think or reference the Father, you don't have any access to the Father apart from me. And ultimately, what is the goal of apologetics? Just to mentally convince people of a position? No, it's actually to convince them logically that there are good reasons, or only good reasons, or that
there are. Okay, it's to convince people that there are good reasons, but Jay hasn't provided any good reasons to think that doing natural theology is not the way to provide someone with good reasons for believing it.
Christianity is the only position that should be accepted. In other words, we aren't intending to create not more philosophers in a Hellenic pagan sense. We're actually intending to convert people to Christ. Now, when I hear Trent's approach, really what I want to drill down to is that the Trent's approach is based on a presupposition about how epistemology works. And Trent basically follows the ancient and medieval world's approach that metaphysics is prior to epistemology. Of course, after him and Kant, the whole modern world questions this and actually just asks for a justification for it.
I mean, I think that sort of shows a bit of an ignorance of medieval philosophy, because again, for a very long time, up until the later medieval period, Augustine's doctrine of divine illumination, which would seem very, very Christian, was, predominant in Western circles, at least.
Or assuming that you can do your metaphysics before you do the legwork of your epistemology. In other words, you have now a gigantic epistemic bootstrapping agenda that you have to get through if you want to demonstrate any of your first principles or arguments that you would make on the basis of those first principles. So because he follows the Parapathetic Axiom of Aquinas accepts in De Veritate the Parapathetic Axiom, at least as far as I can tell. Trent accepts it. I haven't heard anything that makes me think he doesn't. Then the Parapathetic Axiom literally states that anything there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses. And of course, the devastating critique of this that many modern epistemologists have pointed out is that proposition itself is not evident in sense experience. So in other words, now Trent is in the horns of a dilemma, because if he wants to argue on the assumption of Aristotelian anthropology and epistemology, then he's stuck in the position of affirming what Aristotle says in posterior analytics, prior analytics, physics, and I'll reference these later, that there's two ways that we go about knowing things. One is that which is better known in itself, and that which is better known by us, right? That which is better known by us refers to the empirical evidence that we have referring back to the first cause. In
All right,
the
Jay.
case,
Try to wrap up your opening statement.
how much time do I have?
Technically, the time's run out, but I don't want to cut you off. From whatever your final thought was.
Okay. So essentially, this results in. I'll get to this later, perhaps, but just as a way to restate the point that the peripatetic axiom itself is not self-justifying or self-referential. And so this would mean that really none of Trent's arguments or claims from natural theology would get off the ground until he deals with the multiple well-known problems. This is my closing statement here of this. In modern epistemology, such as the myth of the given, the underdetermination of data, the inability to justify the peripatetic axiom itself, that there are properly basic beliefs, that there's an external world, that the external world causally impresses itself upon our senses. So that's where I'll end it there.
So what's his problem with natural theology is it involves you, because I'm just not sure that he really has made an argument against it. He's argued against a few specific positions. Is there a general argument being made that any position anyone takes in philosophy is rationally defeasible or something? And so using philosophy to argue for God is going to be rationally defeasible, and our belief shouldn't be rationally defeasible or something? I just don't know. I mean, he's not said that. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Jay. And I think in the future, what I'll do is if we have 10 seconds left, I'll just kind of make the screen look like this, and you can see okay, 10 seconds left. But yeah, thank you, Jay. Trent, are you ready to go?
I'm ready.
All right. Whenever you start talking, I'll start the timer.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank Swan for hosting the debate. I'm really glad Jay's participating in it. For the purpose of the debate, we can define natural theology using a definition from the First Vatican Council. God, the source and end of all things, can be known with certainty from the consideration of created things by the natural power of human reason. Eastern Orthodox philosopher Richard Swinburne describes natural theology as the task of reasoning about God, quote, from propositions which theists and atheists alike can recognize as obviously true. Now, let me be clear that people can come to know God apart from natural theology, like through religious experience. And human reason cannot cause us to desire God's offer of salvation. The Catechism of the Catholic Church puts it this way: man's faculties make him capable of coming to a knowledge of the existence of a personal God.
I'm pausing. What I want to do is draw out what I see as the difference in style so far between Trent and Jay's presentation. So, Jay put across a lot of information, but I don't even know, what he meant by the main central part of the debate that's at hand, in this video. I don't know how he's using the words. I don't really know what his argument is against it. So far in Trent's discussion, notice that in Trent's opportunity to articulate his position, notice that he's opened by defining the term natural theology, and then he's laid out exactly what the position is that he's defending as defined by Catholicism and the Vatican councils, some council that I can't remember the number of or what date or whatever. And now I think he's going to go to provide reasons for it, which is in stark contrast to sort of what Jay did.
But for man to be able to enter into real intimacy with him, God willed both to reveal himself to man and to give him the grace of being able to welcome this revelation in faith. The proofs of God's existence, however, can predispose one to faith and help one to see that faith is not opposed to reason. In the rebuttal period, I'll address why the case that Jay gave doesn't refute natural theology. But for now, I'm going to offer 5 reasons why Christians should not reject natural theology.
So that's important as well, because notice that a lot of Jay's opening statement was to do with talking about reasons that Trent is wrong. Reasons why Aristotelianism is wrong, reasons why Thomism is wrong, stuff like that. But Trent's saying, well, I'm not going to do that in my opening statement because the reason I'm here is to try and communicate to you what my position actually is and provide reasons for it. And I think that that's a better way of going about doing an opening statement in these things, which is difficult. But I think if you're going to do it, the onus is on trying to like clearly just present what your position is, rather than sort of stampede everyone with a bunch of names and facts and dates and things like that.
Number one, the Bible teaches that we have freedom in Christ. St. Paul writes, "For freedom, Christ has set us free." 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says Christians could eat meat offered to idols. Romans 14, they can celebrate Jewish feast days. Christians could also not do these things if it made them uncomfortable, but they couldn't demand other Christians do the same. This means believers are free to pursue any kind of theology as long as it doesn't violate the teachings of the church. So if my opponent says Christians have a moral duty to abandon natural theology, he'd have to show where the church has taught this. And I don't think he's made that claim tonight. It's the default position that we can pursue it, unless we have a good reason not to. But if Jay says we have a prudential duty, like it's just not a good idea, then he needs to show why the greatest thinkers in church history, like Aquinas, Augustine, Gregory the Theologian, John of Damascus, Athanasius, the apostles, and our Lord Jesus Christ, why they were wrong in using this method to demonstrate truths about God. Reason number two, the church has infallibly taught the validity of natural theology. No ecumenical council has ever condemned natural theology, and the First Vatican Council infallibly declared, if anyone says that the one true God, our Creator and Lord, cannot be known with certainty from the things that have been made by the natural light of human reason, let him be anathema. So especially if you're Catholic, you cannot accept my opponent's position tonight. Number three, natural theology has a long history in the Christian tradition, both in the Western and Eastern Church. St. Paul declared in Romans 1:20, ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. My opponent agrees Paul is drawing.
So I criticize Jay for mentioning people that you may not have heard of, and not really saying why their points are relevant. I'm going to press play just because that's not a very flattering play. But like even if you weren't familiar with the people that Trent is quoting, which presumably you are if you're in these circles because it's Paul, but even if you weren't, it's clear to see how that quote is directly relevant to the position that Trent is putting forward. Whereas with some of the things that Jay was saying, it wasn't clear how they were directly relevant. And there would be vague notions to things like, the epistemology of the logi or something, but it was never really it was never really articulated what that meant. Whether it was a criticism of Trent's position specifically, or a position that Jay was putting forward as the strong position that he adopts and one should adopt and that he's going to defend.
Deuterocanonical Book of Wisdom, which says in chapter 13, from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their creator. Even critics of natural theology like Andrew Moore say, it is unquestionable that knowledge of God is here ascribed to man in the cosmos. Paul also told the Greeks that wanted to worship him in Acts 14 to turn to the true God, who, quote, did not leave himself without witness, for he did good and gave you from heaven rains and fruitful seasons. In these verses, we have the beginnings of teleological or design arguments for God. St. Maximus the Confessor said, the saints learned of the Creator's existence from the things created by him. Design arguments can be found in Clement of Alexandria, Theophilus of Antioch, Augustine, and other church fathers, though with different illustrations. St. John Chrysostom says that just as a ship won't last a mile without a crew, the universe could not be ordered without a supreme intelligence guiding it. St. Basil the Great said, quote, the world is a work of art, displayed...
Was it a different Basil that Jay was talking about? I suppose they can't be the same because it's an intentional context. But he did mention a Basil, but I can't remember if it was it Basil of Caesarea. Basil the Great is Basil of Caesarea, right?
For the observation of all people, to make them know him who created it. Gregory the theologian gives an argument similar to the modern fine-tuning argument, which says the laws of nature are not the product of chance or necessity, so they must have been designed. Gregory writes of the world, do these belong to chance or to something else? Surely not to chance. And what can this something else be but God? Thus, reason that proceeds from God leads us up to God through visible things, which is the task of natural theology. St. Gregory of Nyssa said, should he say there is no God, then from the consideration
I'm going to speed up the video a little bit.
of the skillful and wise economy of the universe, he will be brought to acknowledge that there is a certain overmastering power manifested through these channels. So St. Gregory talks about dealing with an atheist. My opponents previously said natural theology can't prove there's only one God. That's not what Gregory of Nyssa thought. He continued, if on the other hand, he should have no doubt as to the existence of deity, but should be inclined to entertain the presumption of a plurality of gods, then we will adopt against him some such train of reasoning as this, and it includes arguments from monotheism. Paul said in Acts 17, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. So in this incident, Paul acknowledged that the Greeks used reason to correctly arrive at the truth that God exists, but they were ignorant about God's saving nature. In order to find further common ground with them, Paul quoted Greek poets who said, he is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. From this, we see the seeds of the cosmological argument, specifically the argument from motion. For example, in the Ambiguous, St. Maximus the Confessor says, nothing moves without a cause. Then no being is unmoved, except the prime mover. St. John of Damascus said, for everything that is moved by another thing. And who again is it that moves that? And so on to infinity, till we at length arrive at something motionless. For the first mover is motionless, and that is the deity. This is about 700 years before the time of Aquinas. And according to theologian Thomas Torrance, quote, it was, in fact, on the foundations laid by John of Damascus that Western thinkers like St. Thomas based their natural theology. You can also find the beginning of a moral argument for God's existence in Romans chapter 2, 14 through 15, where Paul says Gentiles who don't have the law, Mosaic law, quote, show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness. St. Athanasius argues in a similar way, saying of idolaters, for neither was the law for the Jews alone. They were for all the world a holy school of the knowledge of God. Athanasius even said in the same passage that the holiness of the saints could be sufficient evidence that God exists. Finally, let's consider the history of the argument from miracles. The Old Testament prophet Elijah demonstrated the superiority of Yahweh by challenging the prophets of Baal to a miracle contest. Our Lord told his critics in John 10, if I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me, and I am in the Father. Jesus is saying that even if you don't believe his words, his miraculous deeds should be enough evidence to show he is the Messiah. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, Paul presents a list of witnesses of Christ's resurrection to answer doubts people had about the general resurrection. He also noted some of these witnesses were still alive, presumably so people could investigate them. St. John of Damascus said arguments for God are necessary for people who did not witness miracles firsthand and their converting power. He wrote, but since the wickedness of the evil one has prevailed so mightily against man's nature, as even to drive some into denying the existence of God, so the disciples of the Lord and his apostles, made wise by the Holy Spirit and working wonders in his power and grace, took them captive in the net of miracles and drew them up out of the depths of ignorance to the light of the knowledge of God. Finally, the First Vatican Council infallibly declared, if anyone...
So the reason I think what Trent is saying is relevant here is because it's his opening statement where he is supposed to make the case for why he thinks that natural theology is valid. And there's a sort of twofold argument going on, right? One layer of the argument are the individual quotes that he's reading out from various theologians about why natural theology is something that's useful for people. So, for example, like the one that's just given or just about to be given, that well, for people who hadn't seen these miracles, they needed natural theology in order to be able to increase their confidence or something like that, right? So that the content of the quotations that he's reading are reasons to support the position that he's adopted. But then the second layer of the argument that there is to what he's giving is that each of these people that he's quoting are sources of authority for pretty much all of them. I think both Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Eastern Orthodoxes, Eastern Orthodox persons, and Roman Catholics, because they're church fathers from before the schism, right? That both churches sort of accept as authoritative, and councils that I mean, maybe not the Latin councils, some of them that he's quoting, but certainly some of the councils are going to be authoritative for the Eastern Orthodox Church as well.
Anyone says that miracles can never be known with certainty, nor can the divine origin of the Christian religion be proved from them, let him be anathema. So we see in the West and the Eastern Church, going back 2,000 years, a constant uniform belief that the natural power of human reason can lead people to understand basic truths about God, his existence, and nature. Number 4, natural theology is superior to its alternatives. My opponent advocates for a kind of presuppositionalism that claims it is impossible to justify belief in logic, knowledge, or morality without presupposing the God of what he calls Orthodox Christian faith exists. But my opponent's case for presuppositionalism is refuted by the following dilemma. Either Jay is arguing from created things to God, and so he's doing natural theology, or he's arguing from the assumption God exists to created things in order to prove God exists, which is the logical fallacy of circular reasoning. Consider the first option in the dilemma. William Lane Craig's moral argument for God goes like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. It sounds like, if you read my opponent's argument one way, he's just taken out moral values and duties and replaced it with...
Yeah, because when Craig says if objective moral values, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. That's very similar to like one of Jay's transcendentals, right?
With logic, knowledge, and morality. If God does not exist, these things don't exist. They do exist, so God exists.
Yeah, so it's just putting, like in Craig's argument there, it's just putting God as a necessary condition for objective moral values and duties, which is the exact same as what Jay's doing, the form of Jay's reasoning when he does his like transcendentals thing.
But if that's the case, he's doing natural theology. He has to prove logic, morality, and knowledge exist, and they have no natural explanations for these things. But maybe Jay is saying that actually, no, our ability to even have knowledge of these things or any knowledge whatsoever presupposes the God of Orthodox Christian faith. And so that needs to be the first premise of our argument. So instead of starting with created things and reasoning to the creator, we get the other horn of the dilemma. Jay starts with the creator and uses that to show knowledge is possible so we can know the creator exists. But as the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig says, presuppositionalism is guilty of a logical howler. It commits the informal fallacy of petitio principii, or begging the question, for it advocates presupposing the truth of Christian theism in order to prove Christian theism. We know this is the case because we could ask Jay, well, why couldn't we start with another presupposition, like atheistic nihilism that says we're mistaken and we live in an illogical, amoral, unintelligible universe? Atheistic Platonism, which says logic, knowledge, and morality are just abstract concepts or brute facts. Polytheism, non-Christian monotheism, or many forms of Christian theism my opponent rejects, like Van Tillian, Calvinist presuppositionalism, or just presupposing the God of Catholicism, who's absolutely simple, exists. And once again, the dilemma raises its ugly head. If Jay offers arguments which say these other presuppositions don't work and only his theology explains the world, then he's doing natural theology, but in a kind of strange backwards sort of way. But if he just asserts that his brand of theism just has to be our starting point because it's true, well, he's making an invalid argument we don't have to take seriously because it's assuming the very thing it's trying to prove. Finally, number 5, the objections to natural theology are not sound. I'll address more of Jay's objections in my rebuttal, but I do have some common ones here that I have noticed him bring up before. One is on the issue of natural contemplation, that I agree that natural theology is not like natural contemplation in Eastern Orthodoxy. That is the second stage of contemplating God after you've practiced the virtues in the active life. But Dionysios Sclerus from the University of Athens, he says, quote, while natural revelation is distinct from an argument from design in natural theology, natural revelation is nevertheless in the vicinity of natural theology, as it may include a short informal inference from perceived features of the world to the existence of God. Even Father Staniloy in Orthodox dogmatic theology says, quote, the rationality of the cosmos attests to the fact that the cosmos is the product of a rational being. So it's there for rational people to perceive. We just might be having a semantic difference about who is able to perceive it and who isn't. Another issue that comes with natural theology that Jay has brought up is, well, he's brought up before the issue of empiricism, that you have to start with the Parapathetic Axiom. Everything is in the senses, and that can be disproven. The problem with that is that he's conflating Thomism with strict empiricism. Thomas doesn't do that. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, quote, "We should not attribute to medieval writers the kind of genetic or blank slate empiricism later found in the work of John Locke. Aquinas said our knowledge arises in De Veritate, quote, partly from within and partly from without, and that there is some truth in the idea that, quote, we already know that which we learn. So Aquinas' epistemology is not subject to the self-contradictions of strict empiricism because that's not what he's doing. Then that means that we can infer and apply concepts when we see isolated things, from a triangle to triangularity, a effect to causation, and then we can reason from that up. Yeah, and otherwise, yeah, I think I've covered all of that. I'll save some of the other rebuttals here when I.
So I think that was a far stronger opening statement than Jay's, because it's very clear what Jay's position. It's very clear what Trent's position is, and his reasons for believing it, both from various arguments, church history, and scripture as well. So all of those things. Whereas I'm genuinely just not sure what Jay's argument was, other than criticizing a slice of the positions available to people who are Christians and do engage in natural theology.
When I come back, but otherwise, I think I've shown. Remember, Jay has the burden of proof. He's got to give us the good reasons to think we ought to get rid of natural theology, all natural theology. You could even disagree with Thomism and
Swan's rocking out there. I'm sure.
Pick another natural theology. This debate is not about Catholic natural theology. It's about natural theology in general, and why we should give up something that 1 Peter 3:15 says can always help us be prepared to make a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence.
All right, thank you, Trent. Yeah, and so that completes the 15 minutes opening statements, and now we're going to our 7-minute rebuttals. Jay, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
All right, and once again, I felt kind of bad, stopping at the end, and so when you have 10 seconds left, I'm going to expand the screen like this. All right, whenever you start talking, I'll start the timer.
Right. Well, I'm glad that Trent affirmed Richard Swinburne, because it was exactly the referent in my the Garrity paper that is critiqued. And the first thing that comes up, of course, is that Trent says that theists and atheists alike agree that these things are true. That's the very thing that I'm calling into question. Not whether people think that they have things in common, but whether they can justify the things that they believe are in common. Trent goes on to say that he believes that this demonstration shows a personal God. There is no generic conception of personhood that is not theory laden. I'm surprised that Trent thinks that there is, because it's not very hard to see in the history of the debates of the church into how they went into noting that the notion of person in Christian theism is actually a revealed category. It's not something that's revealed or known via natural theology. And even in his theology, he thinks he could bypass the Trinitarian relationships to get to some sort of personhood that doesn't specifically reference or pick out the Trinity. The problem here is that in most of Trent's references, he didn't actually address the issue that I'm bringing up, which is about rigid and flaccid designators. Trent just assumes that all the references in these various quotes that he quote mine actually prove his position, when the very thing that I'm asking.
Okay, so I think Jay's point here then is to say that the arguments that are being given by the people that by the people that Trent was quoting don't refer to the same entities, because they're being used in intentional contexts. Now, why? I also think he undermines himself on this point later when he says something about the logos. Oh yeah, he says something about the logos later. He says, now the difference with the logos is that it is a rigid designator. And he goes, but I don't mean the logos like Marcus Aurelius or Heraclitus. I mean and it's like, oh, so hang on, it can be used to mean different things. I found his use of the terminology here of rigid designator versus flaccid designator, or non-rigid, as the non-erotic folk might call it, to just be unhelpful, really, and muddying the waters, because it's not clear. It's not clear precisely how it makes his objection any clearer. I mean, Trent could say, okay, then that maybe that undercuts the authority of what the person said, because like taking it as their quote when we say this church father believed that, well, we don't know that they had the same thing in mind as I do when I'm uttering it, but it doesn't undercut Trent's uttering of the argument, because Trent does have in mind the same reference if he's using them as reasons in support of the same conclusion. So at least as far as Trent is concerned, all the arguments he's given are in support of the same conclusion, even if for the other people in those intentional contexts, right, it's not in support of the same conclusion. So
asking is about reference themselves. Natural theology is premised on the presupposition that the word God is itself, or the word monotheism is itself, a rigid designator. It's not.
Another reason why I think that the use of rigid designator here is inappropriate is because rigid designator means that the term picks out the same thing in every possible world, but the argument isn't appealing to possible worlds, right? Trent isn't making an argument from what the word means in other possible worlds, and Jay isn't criticizing him for talking about what the word means. Well, he sort of is by saying it's not a rigid designator. He only means how the word is used in the actual world. And again, so I think it just makes everything much clearer. And I think what he actually means is just that people are using words with different senses, right?
It is not a pronoun. It does not pick out a specific referent. Within Scripture itself, we have many examples of the word God being used in this flaccid way.
Yeah, so look, he's saying here, God doesn't pick out, it's not a rigid designator because, and then gives an example of equivocation, right? In the actual world rather than what it might mean in different possible worlds. But then what's interesting about this is that he's going to say, well, in that people use it in different senses, so it's not rigid. And then he's later going to say, but the logos is rigid, but not in the sense that these people meant it. So he's not met his own criteria for a rigid designator when he does want to use it. I just think that Jay's approach here is self-contradictory in respect to that, and overly confusing when he's sort of using these technical terms when they need not be used. It's just unhelpful.
Way. For example, God can pick out demons. God can pick out the persons or the essence or the attributes of the one true God. God can pick out human beings who are gods to Pharaoh, for example, in the case of Moses. I have said you are all gods. So the word God is just a bait and switch in the premise of all of the natural theistic and especially the monotheistic argumentation. Now, Trent is apparently unaware of the fact that the Cappadocians and nobody before the time of the 1600s, namely, at least in English, the character of Henry More in the 1600s, as Dr. Branson has shown throughout his work, used the word monotheism. He just presupposed that when the Cappadocians used the word mono or arche, that they're talking about monotheism. Now, I'm not disagreeing with the meaning of a single God, but in the theology of the Cappadocians, the reference of the one God or the monarche is the person of the Father. It is always picked out as the person of the Father. In fact, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed says, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. So we have the preeminence of personhood. And in any Trinitarian theology, we pick out the person of the Father, and that's the only way in which the mode of person exists. There's no such thing as a generic mode of person. For Trent's arguments to work at all, for him to say that there's a generic conception of personhood, or that God has a generic personhood that permeates the universe that he knows apart from Father, Son, and Spirit, which is what his position necessitates, is literally impossible. There is no such thing. And again, the fallacies that are listed in the Garrity paper show in multiple ways and in multiple examples how the word God is simply not a rigid designator.
I don't know if Trent's arguments do rely on God having a personhood that permeates through the universe. I mean, maybe some of them do again. But to my mind, at least, most of the kinds of arguments that someone like Trent is going to use are to do with inferring, a cause from its effects, right? Which isn't an inference from the personhood permeating through the universe. It's from seeing the kinds of effects and then inferring the type of cause that caused them. So I'm not sure that Jay's criticism there is relevant.
Designator, it's flaccid. So it doesn't tell you what it's picking out without the context of the rest of the beliefs. And I gave examples from contrasting it with Islam, or we could contrast it with something even absurd like a cult, right? There's plenty of cults that say, well, I believe in Jesus. You believe in Jesus. Does that mean the referent is the same because it's the same word? No, it's begging the question. And Trent is
So that, by that, again, he means different senses. He doesn't mean rigid or flaccid designators. I just think either J hasn't, perhaps rigid designation is used properly in the paper, but again, neither I, in talking to J, or Trent debating the paper, so it's upon J to sort of try and explain what he means or why that use of the terminology is appropriate. But it seems like he just means different senses. He means that, well, he wouldn't even say, I don't think he'd say that there even is a referent of the sense in which the other people mean Jesus. And it's nothing to do with rigid or flaccid designators.
Acting like these are not real philosophical questions, that you can't demonstrate this in a formal, logical way.
Part of what frustrates me as well, when I sort of broached this with Jay in his Discord, was that rather than engaging with my criticism, he sort of jumped straight to trying to teach me to suck eggs, like I was like a 2-year-old, like just telling me this random stuff about Quine. And I don't know, it's just very frustrating when you want someone to be able. I don't think Jay can like actually engage with the criticism, and so I think that he can't find out when he's wrong because of that, because he's got some kind of vice or something where he can't actually like hear or listen to the disagreement and engage with it. It's why it kind of feels like he's shouting at you when he's disagreeing as well, rather than sort of working through thoughts or trying to explain why there's a difference or something.
Which the Garrity paper does, and which I gave multiple examples showing it. Now, again, as we move on, the Greek word of polytheia is usually contrasted, right, by the Cappadocians and the early church fathers to the monoarche. Monoarche is not the same thing as monotheia. Monotheia, which again, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It really depends on the context and the embedded meaning that it has in the theory in which it's embedded. And so this is how words and language work. And so Trent is acting like there's been no development or no questions that are relevant that have been asked since the ancient and medieval world. But the ancient medieval world didn't typically ask theory-laden, presuppositional, paradigm-level questions that Hume and Kant do ask. So it's fine if Trent doesn't want to address the types of things that Hume and Kant bring up in regard to linguistics, and somebody like Vico and later linguistic philosophers bring up in regard to referent questions. But that's precisely the type of question that I'm asking. And that's what the Garrity paper critiques in the fallacy that underlies the assumption of general theism. There is no general theism unless Trent can show how somehow a priori or somehow from the created order, he has a generic conception of personhood that at the same time matches up to the Muslim conception of personhood, but also somehow matches up to personhood in Christian Trinitarian theology. But guess what? It doesn't. If you ask a Muslim, any Muslim, go into the Muslim system about what the personhood of God is, it does not mean what the Cappadocians and St. Cyril and the church fathers who wrote tons of pages explicating what prosopon and hypostasis means. Doesn't mean that at all. Totally different. Totally different. The fact that there's overlap does not prove a common core religion any more than two card games that are played because they have cards and because they have rules in common, share therefore a common core card game. There's nothing in common between Crazy Eights and poker simply because
there's notice that statement as well. There's nothing in common between Crazy Eights and poker because they use cards. Well, it seems like that's it's like, there's nothing in common between this pen and this pen if you're not allowed to talk about the fact that they're both approximately cylindrical and that they're both pens and they both have a ballpoint and that they both have ink that comes out of them and they can both be held in my hand and they're both about the same length. But just don't mention any of those things that they do have in common, and then there's nothing in common between them. Like that's a bad way of making an argument.
There's cards and rules. This is the fallacy that his whole position rests on, is that there is that thing. Now, he went on to cite Augustine, Aquinas, Athanasius, Gregory, Nazianzus, as if they teach the same thing, and they don't. That's a presupposition.
Part of the problem with this as well is that it's going to cut both ways for Jay. So he's weaponizing this intentional context thing against Trent. But I think if he took his own criticism here seriously, it would actually mean that for all of the people that he's quoting, he actually doesn't have any idea what the person who he's attributing these propositions to meant by it, because they're all being quoted in intentional context as well. So he has to either then rebut this objection himself, in which case Trent's okay, or the objection stands and it undercuts the very points that Jay is making. You know, like how does he even know that this guy who's talking about intentional context, right, is meaning the same thing as him when that's in an intentional context? Like I think it's the idea of intentional context here is sort of being malformed a bit and used in an inappropriate way by Jay. And even if it isn't, it's being used in this single-handed way just to cut against Trent when it should cut back against him as well if he's being consistent.
In which multiple writers, Dr. Bradshaw, the Rodegowitz thesis shows that they do not, in fact, teach the same thing. He mentioned that God's eternal power is seen. Quoting the text that I quoted, God's eternal power, I don't even think in your view, is created. Do you think that creatures can see the eternal power in this life? I don't think he thinks that, because he believes in, the beatific vision. You don't have a direct perception of God in this life, especially not in the analogia entis doctrine of Aquinas. Now, he tried to cite Maximus as if Maximus's text about natural law.
The analogy of being, right, you can only talk about God by analogy. That's what that is.
Or natural contemplation proved natural theology in his system. But in fact, Maximus, according to Szyszynski, a Roman Catholic, now Orthodox scholar of the Filioque in the Middle Ages, says, to utilize the language of later theology, Maximus's program there can be no analogia entis without the analogia fide. So if I were to give you a chart to show how this works in Maximus's system, it's actually directed this way. We perceive creatures which direct us to the principles, which direct us to the logi, which direct us to the logos. The logos is a rigid designator. It means...
Okay, so here is a big fat contradiction coming up. I remember this.
Direct us to the principles, which direct us to the logi, which direct us to the logos. The logos is a rigid designator. It means the second person of the Godhead. It does not mean something like the logos of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And so that logos is another good example of the fact that...
So isn't that interesting? Before, when Jay was having problems with the fact that God is used in different senses by people, even though it's the same noise or the same sequence of letters, right? It can mean different things. Well, now he's saying that that isn't the case for logos, but in telling us what he means by logos, he refers to other uses of it, which would be equivocal, which he doesn't mean by it. It's just a mess. I mean, that's not very nice of me, but it's...
That the fact that the word omniscience or eternal or one God is used is irrelevant to actually demonstrating what the reference is. Is that my time? Or
Yeah, that's your time,
okay.
Jay. But thank you. All right. Trent, are you ready to go?
I am.
All right. 7-minute rebuttal starting whenever Trent begins speaking.
All right, so remember, Jay has the burden to show us that we cannot use reason to show basic facts about God. I'm not saying that reason can prove everything about God. I don't really know any theists that believe that. I know some theists that go pretty far and think you can use reason to prove the Trinity or prove almost everything in theology. I'm not prepared to affirm that. Most aren't. So I'm not saying reason can prove everything about God, but man, through natural human reason, can come to affirm shared propositions. So let me try to get through some of these arguments that Jay brought up. Essentially, his primary argument seems to be natural theology rests on the idea that there is a generic theism that can be defended because we all disagree about God's properties, his attributes, his intentions. There is no such thing as this generic theism. Therefore, there can't be natural theology. But that falls apart when you start to think about it. To say that God is this rigid designator and it always has to refer to the Trinity, that's false. Did Abraham believe in God? Did Moses believe in God? Yeah. Did they believe in the Trinity during their earthly lifetime? Maybe they had an implicit knowledge of it. I don't know. But they certainly did not have the theological knowledge of the Trinity that Jay has or I have. So they did not believe in the Trinity like we do. Yet we could say they believed in God. I think the problem here is that we have to understand that terms can differ in sense and referent. Okay. So when I say that Kal-El and Clark Kent are, well, that's the same person. When I say the morning star is the evening star, Hesperus is Phosphorus, I'm talking about the same planet, Venus. We just give it two different names based on how it appears in the sky. And we can do something similar with God, understanding that people can make arguments and affirm truths about God. And the God they're talking about the same referent, but it differs in sense. So I'll give you a parallel argument. I believe water exists, and Aristotle believed water exists. But I believe also that water is H2O. Aristotle didn't do that. Aristotle and I have very dramatically different views about what water is, but we can still both affirm that water exists. Water is wet. Water quenches thirst. Even though we don't agree on all the propositions related to water and its existence, we agree on the most important core ones. And the paper that Dyer is referring to, I think it's from some atheist professor in the University of Budapest. I remember reading it a while ago. he misses this when saying that, yeah, just because something shares something in common doesn't mean it's the core, but it's an essential property. You take it away, it loses its essence and its identity. So even though natural theologians disagree amongst each other, they can still affirm the same propositions about that referent. They can affirm there is one God, there is that polytheism is false, that God created the world, that God is immaterial, that God is beyond time, that God is all powerful, worthy of worship. And we do see this in natural theology. Among the classical theologians, Avicenna, Aristotle, Aquinas, Anselm, for 2,000 years history, they affirm even more divine immutability, simplicity, other things like that. Now, you might reject some of that natural theology, like divine simplicity. That's okay. We're not debating particular natural theologies. We're debating the concept itself. So I think Jay's main concern here is, okay, you can use this. You're saying, he said earlier, well, you've got a bunch of metaphysical baggage in trying to affirm Catholic theology, and Orthodoxy doesn't have metaphysical baggage, uncreated energies, energy essence distinction. I'm not saying those things are false.
I'm going to address this comment. So, GPL, this response to me shows me that you haven't understood what I said. Yeah, my point was just that. My point was that Aurelius and Maximus did not mean the same thing by the Logos. So we're in agreement here with the thing that you think you're saying that contradicts me. What I'm saying, which I think you've missed, is that Jay's criticism of the kind of terms used in natural theology, like God, for example, is that they can be used in different senses. Even though he's going to say he means rigid designator, but I'm not sure he does always mean that. Maybe the paper means that. But at least what Jay means from what he's articulated is that the term can be used in different senses, and we can't guarantee that it's being used in the same sense by everyone. Then what Jay goes on to say is that the word logos isn't one of these words, right? That was the big contradiction that he got caught up in. He said, it's not one of those words. It can only be used. It's a rigid designator, by which Jay means only has one sense, but whatever. And then he says, not like the logos of Marcus Aurelius, right? Or I don't think he said Heraclitus, maybe I added that in. But that's the ridiculous part, because that is the very criticism that he is levying against terms like God, is that they can be used equivocally. And because the term logos is used equivocally in classical philosophy, he has to say, yeah, but not that use, I mean this use, even though it doesn't. So it then does fall under his criticism. That's the problem. So I just don't think you've understood my criticism.
False. I'm just saying that Jay will have to do the same kinds of natural theology explanations that I would for the attributes that I believe in. He just calls it by another name, by this presuppositionalism. No, I'm not. The fact that all monotheists believe in one God and we can say that they're worshiping the same God does not commit the quantifier shift fallacy. Because I could say every astronomer believes there is one star in our solar system. And it follows from that basic truth, every astronomer studies the same star in our solar system because they're all committed to the view our solar system has only one star. We can say the same for the fathers of the church, for even other world religions. If someone's committed there is one ultimate infinite creator, then they're giving worship to this being, but they disagree about it. They disagree about the propositions that are involved. And as I said before, Jay's presuppositionalism, we'll just presuppose the God of Orthodox Christian theism. That doesn't get us out of the lurch because you could easily presuppose any of these other competitors. He hasn't given us an independent reason to see otherwise. Instead, what he's given us is something that practices circular reasoning to say, well, we have to, that's because he hasn't defended as much in this debate, but that would be my question to him. If we don't use natural theology, how would we demonstrate to people that God exists? And the view he's endorsed previously is just, well, we know that the foundational truth that Jay says we can't believe in foundational truths, but he hasn't given an argument, by the way, to say that we can't believe in foundational truths like foundational, I mean self-evident, by the way, that we don't need other reasons to believe in these truths. Otherwise, you'd have an infinite regress. He has not given us a reason to think there aren't self-evident truths that are immediately available to us from which we can reason about reality and then to reality's origin. Self-evident truths like, I exist. I experience mental change. I am having perceptions. Perceptions may not be accurate, but I'm having perceptions of some kind. And then building from these self-evident truths to say, well, I'm limited, I'm contingent, I'm changing, that there has to be some kind of explanation given other things that we perceive. Jay said that, Hume showed that we can't have these basic truths about causality. Hume's just wrong about that, frankly. We can get into that more into my next rebuttal. But yeah, ultimately, if the arguments Jay is making against natural theology would also apply to presuppositionalism. The only way he can get out of it is to say, well, no, presuppositionalism just is true. It just is our starting founding point, and we know that because it's the true revelation, which of course is circular reasoning. It's like saying the Bible. It's like saying the Bible is the word of God. The Bible says God exists, therefore God exists. Circular arguments are invalid. Instead, natural theology provides us the valid way to show that God does exist.
All right, thank you, Trent. We're now getting into our 4-minute rebuttal section. So this is now Jay's 4-minute rebuttal. Jay, whenever you're ready, just go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad that Trent referenced something as easily philosophically just too devastating to his positions, like the Cartesian position that I can have a self-evident knowledge of my own existence. I mean, this has been savagely refuted by both Kant and Bertrand Russell in numerous ways to demonstrate that there is no self-evident positions. And
so this, I mean, maybe Descartes' position has been devastatingly refuted by Bertrand Russell, right? But it seems like Bertrand Russell's pretty committed to perceptual givens in his theory of sense datum, right? Sense datum are perceptual givens. So, like, why? Maybe it's because it's just the context of a debate or whatever, but why does it need to be the utterly destructed, like, bro talk thing?
The epistemic bootstrapping thing that Trent's system is committed to is impossible for him to do. In other words, he affirmed a position which is known there as a kind of strong foundationalism. The problem with strong foundationalism is that for something like Descartes' position to make the statement to be meaningful that I exist assumes a host of things that he's not justified. And the whole point with his position is that you shouldn't affirm things that you can't justify in terms of starting points. So Trent is misunderstanding.
I mean, I think some of that criticism maybe is right against foundationalism, but I mean, equally, there's problems of that kind for coherentism as well. All views have some problems of that kind when you get down to those levels.
That I'm critiquing the starting points of his position. I'm not saying that I don't have to do legwork and that orthodoxy doesn't have metaphysics. It's an issue of accounting for the metaphysics. It's not an issue of do I believe in metaphysics? Do we share metaphysical notions in common like teleology or causation? It's a question of justifying, giving an account for, and grounding those principles, JTB, and of course the fourth position if we look at the Gettier problem. Now, he continues to say that reason can say some things about God. And again, this response just presupposes that God is a rigid designator. He attributed to me the position that God must be a rigid designator. If it's going to pick out something that's common to the religions, then yes. I mean, is Trent arguing for a generic God that isn't picked out somehow? No, of course. And the fact that he goes into attributes like person or personal shows that this, again, doesn't work because there's no generic theory neutral concept of person apart from, in the Christian paradigm, the Trinity. Trent doesn't have a basic understanding of what the presuppositional argument is. It's not a circular argument that just says it's true because therefore it's true and I cite it and therefore.
Well, your beliefs about, I mean, what does he mean the Trinity isn't a theory-laden concept of a person? Because for a coherentist, anything that I know about the Trinity or anything I believe about the Trinity is still a belief, right? It's a belief I have. I can't know about it if I don't have beliefs about it, because the only things I believe are parts of my web of belief, and so those are all going to be theory laden. I just have no idea why Jay is saying some of the things he's saying.
It's true. There's nothing like that. It's a comparison of paradigms because it's a metalogical question. So
this is he says it's a metalogical question. Okay. That I find strange, because metalogic is obviously, it's like the logic of logic, right? It's talking about kind of like proofs with it. So you'd use a logical system to do something, but then you do various proofs and stuff outside the logical system to prove its soundness and consistency and stuff like that. But the types of things Jay's about to say aren't like that.
So Trent keeps collapsing every question into logical questions when the very question I'm raising to him is metalogical.
Like, I've never come across a metalogical proof of God, right? I've never come across in so in this book on metalogic, for example, right? There's no chapter that's like, and chapter 15, first we prove God before we figure out whether propositional logic is complete or something. I don't know why he's saying metalogical.
I'm asking prior questions to metaphysics about the epistemology that goes
Prior to metaphysics or prior to logic, about the epistemology. How can the epistemology come apart from your metaphysics?
that's behind doing the metaphysics.
For a coherentist, you can't tell a story about epistemology without having some metaphysical commitments, because that epistemic story is going to be theory laden.
And that's what the modern philosophers ask. I'm not saying that David Hume is right in his skepticism. I'm merely asking his questions. That doesn't mean that I'm committed to Humeanism or Kantianism. I'm asking the questions that they ask to foundationalist systems, especially strong foundational systems, which Trent just affirmed in the I exist. Well, are you not aware that I exist presupposes that language has meaning? It presupposes that there's an I or a self. It presupposes that there's time determination. Existing is occurring. Those are heavy metaphysical claims and baggage that are not demonstrable on Descartes' foundational cogito. They're assumed. And the business of philosophy is to question assumptions. And that's precisely what I've been doing in this debate. And Trent just says, well, they're just self-evident things. That doesn't get you out of the circularity problem that you say you're here to avoid. Foundationalism is circular. And that's why we say that there's two different orders of things in this question of paradigms, right? There's the day-to-day or mundane type of argumentation that I would do about logic or this or that proposition or fact. But metalogical questions cannot be resolved in that same way. Look at something like Gödel's Incompleteness Theorems, which show that you can't solve those types of problems in a mono-singular way because they reference outside the set. So he's literally trying to repeat something like Bertrand Russell.
They reference outside the set. It just seems to me like Jake kind of mentions these things and has sort of half-baked ideas about what they mean, and it's just not clear why they're relevant. It's not clear why they're relevant to the argument he's making, except in the sense that they might lend credence to Jay as a smart person, because only a smart person would know about these things. And then you're meant to draw the inference that, well, so trust him on these other topics because he's a smart person. But it's not at all relevant to what he's saying.
They reference outside the set. So he's literally trying to repeat something like Bertrand Russell would say to
the references outside that. No, because it's just a diagonalization argument, right? So it's not that it references outside a set. It's just that it's just to show that there are certain things that can't be proven. It doesn't reference outside the set. Maybe the conclusion, or I don't know what he means by that.
Gödel, and I'm just simply saying that set theory shows you, as an example, as an analogy, that you can't just refer to the set itself to justify the set. It extends outside of itself. And
what set theory shows you can't just refer to the set itself to justify the set? Like, what does that mean? In some set theories you can. The problem is that leads to contradictions, right? So then you get set theories where they say, well, you can't refer to the set itself, but that's just an axiom of a different system. I don't get what that's got to do with anything.
And the fact that you appeal to foundationalism shows that you're just self-referencing and doing the very thing that your position says is impossible.
All right, thank you, Jay. Right on time. All right, Trent, your 4-minute rebuttal starts whenever you start talking.
All right, well, I showed why Jay's arguments against natural theology don't work. What about the arguments that I gave in defense of natural theology? What has he said about them? I gave 5 arguments. We have freedom in Christ, so natural theology is the default. We're free to do it unless we have an overwhelming reason to think that we shouldn't. Jay hasn't attacked that reasoning, and he hasn't given us any overwhelming reason. I mean, I think he's trying to say we shouldn't do natural theology because it doesn't work, and he's come nowhere close to establishing that principle. Number 2 is the church infallibly defends natural theology. I know Jay isn't Catholic, but I'm just saying it because it's true, and it hasn't come up, and that hasn't been challenged at all. As to my citation of Scripture and the Fathers, Jay just kind of said, well, he's quote mining them, and he hasn't refuted in any way the arguments I brought up showing that natural theology using reason to show God exists. And go back and re-listen to what I said from the Fathers, especially the Fathers from the East. They're not talking about natural contemplation. They're talking about ways of showing non-believers. Gregory of Nyssa is talking about this. And in the section from Gregory of Nyssa's Great Catechism, I shared an excerpt where he talks about showing atheists God exists and showing polytheists that there is only one God. So you can read it for yourself. I'll upload a document with my citations after this debate if you want to read that. My 4th argument was that presuppositionalism doesn't work. And we've started to talk about that a little bit. But here's the thing with justifying knowledge. This is called Agrippa's Trilemma. There's only 3 ways to justify proposition X is true. You either have an infinite number of other propositions that support it, an infinite regress. If that's the case, you have no knowledge whatsoever. Knowledge disappears under infinite regress. You could have a circular argument, but circular arguments are invalid. We agree that it's invalid. Jay himself even said that in logic, circular arguments are invalid, but he claims, yes, but if it's metalogic, a metalogical question, then we can use circular reasoning. But here's the problem. Circular reasoning doesn't stop the invalidity. The fallaciousness of circular reasoning doesn't stop just because the circle gets bigger. If Jay says, well, yeah, circular reasoning doesn't work in any of this stuff, except for me proving the whole system that it comes from the God of Orthodox Christian faith, then he's now just special pleading. He's saying, yes, circular reasoning is bad, except for the one thing that I need it for here. And once you know the whole rigid designator thing, I would ask these questions. Was Muhammad correct when he said there is one God? No, he didn't fully understand God. But was Moses correct when he said there is one God? Or Abraham? They didn't fully understand the Trinity or God either, yet they understood these propositions. We can look at a series of propositions and see their truth value and the evidence that is behind them. So Jay also claimed that, so foundationalism, self-evident truths, that they're actually not true or that they're circular, but he gave us no evidence to believe that or why we should believe that. And I can use elimination. We know you can't have an infinite regress. We know circular reasoning is invalid no matter how big the circle gets. So we have to start with things that are self-evident. And ultimately, Jay's position, his alternative with presuppositionalism, you'll see the shocking circularity. Ask him, why presuppose the God of Eastern Orthodox Christian faith? Why is that our presupposition instead of all the other presuppositions I gave? The answer Jay will have to give is because it's true. And that, my friends, is circular reasoning. Instead, we should not use fallacious reasoning in our theology for God. We should use valid reasoning. And that's why Christians should not reject natural theology.
All right, thank you, Trent Horn. Now at this point, then, we're going to get into our 8-minute cross-examination periods. Jay is going to lead the first 8-minute session, and then Trent will lead the next 8 minutes. And so what I'll do is when you have 10 seconds left, I'm going to disappear from the chat or disappear from the stream. When you have 10 seconds left, I'll reappear. So I'll just use kind of visual cues instead. So yeah, Jay, whenever you start talking, I'll start the timer.
Again, the question here is about presuppositions for sure. And I've listed many things and many problems for the foundationalist approach that you're advocating. You replied with something to the effect that, well, there's a trilemma that we could refer to, and there's really not many other options here. Well, the fact that you don't think there's many other options actually doesn't count as a justification for the starting point. In other words, you started with properly basic beliefs, and all I have to
Yeah, I think there is the Theobro phase. And I'm also glad, I came out of it, but I sort of had to deconvert to come out of it, I guess. But, the Theobro phase is like really toxic. I guess it exists in Catholicism as well, because you kind of get Thomist Theobros as well, don't you? And it exists in Eastern Orthodoxy, definitely. And it exists in like Reformed circles. But I think maybe it's more prevalent in, particularly a particular kind of American, at least my impression is that it's more prevalent in like a kind of American Calvinism or something. But I get it'd be interesting to see some like data to do some questionnaires of different denominations or something to find out some of that. No, Spartan, you're like the furthest thing from a Theobro. Theobros are like, they're sort of like people who go on about like Joe Rogan and crypto, but it's just like also like random conservative, like biblical, random conservative political positions as well is like one of the things that's part of the sort of like masculine identity. I guess there's kind of Muslim Theobros as well, like Muhammad Hijab and people like that are sort of Muslim Theobros on.
Ask you is that, do you think that the notion of properly basic beliefs themselves is self-evident?
Do you mean the idea, properly basic belief?
Well, if I said only beliefs that are self-evident or incorrigible or evident to the senses are properly basic, the problem is that you're in an infinite circular regress because the proposition itself, in terms of you knowing it, is not part of your sense data, nor can you show that it's properly basic without assuming it.
Well, I would agree that the idea of a properly basic belief may itself not be properly basic, but one could just have
that's not what I asked.
Okay, what did you ask?
The proposition itself about properly basic belief, is it properly basic?
The proposition there are properly basic beliefs?
The proposition only beliefs that are self-evident or incorrigible or evident to the senses are properly basic.
Well, I would say that it's true. You're saying, how do I know what properly basic
No,
beliefs
I didn't
are?
ask if it's true. I'm asking, is that notion itself properly basic?
Like, I struggle so much with how confrontational and combative Jason. No, like, it's so difficult to just have a conversation with this person and sort of like, try and make progress. It's like if he's wrong about something, he's just never going to find out, because even with a competent and articulate person who's expressing the right position, he's just going to batter them over the head with being rude and obnoxious and argumentative.
Basic.
So you're saying that if it is properly basic, it creates some kind of circularity, if I say that?
Yes.
Okay, well, as I said before, I don't know if the description of an idea might be properly basic, but the experience itself is. And then we have terms to describe what the experience is.
It doesn't matter how you redefine it, because the point is that there's no self-evident or incorrigible.
I don't think he's redefining it, because I do actually think that I do think that the important part of the Cogito argument isn't the description. It doesn't matter if you say it in French or English or whatever. What did Joe say? Just tuned in, plan to listen later. But when Jay said something like monotheism is a rigid designator, I knew he was out of his league. Well, so what Jay has said, and it'd be interesting to get your take on this, is he sort of said when people do natural theology, right? When you say, I don't know, Avicenna believed that, and this is me trying to understand Jay's position, that's an intentional context. So you don't know that he actually means the same thing as you when you do natural theology. Now, part of what I think is an issue with the way that Jay's talking about those sorts of things is, I've said this a few times, but it'd be interesting to get your take. So this is why I'm saying that this is he's not making any appeal to what the term might mean in different possible worlds, right? He's just talking plainly about the actual world and how it might be used in a different sense by someone equivocally. But then the other part is, if we do take Jay seriously about what he's saying about these intentional contexts, and that's going to cut against every argument that he makes where he says, Gregory of Nyssa believes that, or anything to that degree. And he's not really told us why it's okay for him to do it, but it's not okay for Trent to do it. And actually, when he does that, he falls straight into Trent's dilemma, because then he is doing natural theology by trying to provide reasons for his conclusion. He's not just begging the question and asserting his conclusion over and over again, even though that was the initial sort of gambit that he went in for, right?
Well, propositions like that found in sense data.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the justification for that?
The justification is that there are some propositions that we encounter, and upon entertaining the proposition, the justification is also immediately apparent. And that's
circularity. That's what
I don't even think the sort of argument that Jay's making about transcendentals and stuff. So when I think about the experience of I am, which it is a different thing, well, I mean, I suppose that could be controversial, and this could be where you get into the weeds a bit. But suppose I think the experience is non-linguistic, and that could be a contentious point, and you could say, well, that the fact that you're saying that that's non-linguistic is theory laden, because I don't think that there is consciousness without a linguistic representation or something. Maybe that's a direction you could go in. But I at least, supposing it is non-linguistic and it is just this sort of experience, it doesn't even necessarily have to presuppose time in this transcendental way. It's not like the passage of time is a necessary condition. Like, there could just be no time or something. I mean, I'm not saying I know what that's like, but and I just am experiencing myself. It'd just be like this, like, weird. It wouldn't be. I mean, it's not even right to say constant experience. It just would be, right? I don't know if Jay's right that you have to presuppose all these things for a kind of incorrigible belief, one that you could not fail to be wrong about.
Well, that's the problem of properly basic beliefs.
No, it's not.
You just said it's immediately apparent. That's circularity.
No, because
Begging the question.
okay, it's not that, because if I say, for example, I am having an experience right now, I am just reporting something that is happening to me.
That's not all you're doing. No, I gave you multiple examples, which you said I didn't do in critiquing the cogito.
Like what?
Of all of the metaphysical things that are assumed in the sentence.
Okay, but even if I don't understand all the concepts that are involved, we can also.
It doesn't matter. This is about justifying the beliefs.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying.
So it doesn't matter. It's about justifying the belief, but it sounds like is Jay saying like non-linguistically justify the belief to me or something? It's like, well, just experience, man. I don't know. I will say though, I think if I was in Trent's position, I would have a really hard time keeping my cool and responding. You know, like just responding in the sense of we're just exploring these ideas, because Jay's being so defensive and combative as well that I think it's very unpleasant as a person to just be confronted with that and have to respond and try and be charitable and stuff like that. And I think if he wants to do, maybe it works for the kind of apologetics he's going in for, but I would think if he cares about, like, you know, truth, beauty, and goodness and all that, that he would be trying not to be like that in his engagements with people.
Saying to me, natural theology is false because there are no self-evident truths.
I'm critiquing your position of a strong foundationalism.
Okay, but even if someone picked a weaker form of foundationalism, I think
that's
a lot
not
of
what you picked. So
well, okay, what I would say,
that's not the position you defended 5 minutes ago.
Okay, but even the position that I have, I would just say a lot of people, even people who are non-believers or atheists, would agree there are just basic facts about existence that we have agreement on.
Okay, so
and from there we can build arguments.
So you're going to appeal to the mass. That's actually a fallacy. It's not a justification.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's
well, I asked for justification. So what's the justification?
The problem is, Jay, I gave you a justification, but your system just won't allow it because
those aren't justifications. Those are fallacies.
No, I told.
What would Jay accept as a justification? I mean, the point is that the problem is that asking what's the justification of a basic belief is just a non-question, right? It's like asking, you know, what's the earliest, what's the last number or something, you know? It's a question of that sort. It's just by definition of something being a foundational belief, it isn't justified by something else. So when Jay's saying, well, what is the justification for your foundational belief? It's just an inappropriate question for Trent's view, because it isn't a justified belief. It isn't justified by something else. It is justified in virtue of being it, right?
Told you that some propositions that we encounter, their truth is immediate, and we do not have to infer them.
I'm asking for the justification. You're just saying that it's immediate, but that rests on the assumption that the external world is properly caused to impress upon your senses.
I would say the justification that the self-evident truths in my epistemology are true would be the same as whatever justification leads you to believe that the God of Christian Orthodoxy is the ultimate foundation.
So I'm not subject to that problem. I don't make the strong foundationalist claim that you just did. So I don't have that problem. I admit circularity at this level.
Okay, but only at that level.
I admit circularity at this level. I find that I'd be interested. I mean, I do think Jay's a coherentist, but if he's saying what, I don't get how he gets away with it, basically, when he says, I admit circularity at that level. Well, why isn't it good enough for someone else just to say, I admit circularity at this level? You know, like, why? Is it just because of the confidence, or?
Right, because it's a metalogical question where circularity is unavoidable.
And that's the thing. It's a metalogical question. Well, but it's not, you're not doing metalogic.
That's the point with set theory and the...
Oh, yeah, and that's the point with set theory. What? That's the point with set theory. I mean, I guess you could use some concepts of set theory in metalogic. But, I mean, it seemed like what he was referring to before was just that some set theory systems have axioms that restrict self-reference. But then that's just an axiom that you introduce. Why is that relevant? I don't know.
The incompleteness theorem.
Okay.
And the incompleteness, like, why is he mentioning it? What about the incompleteness theorem? Is he saying that, you know, God is something that can't be formally proved or something, and so has to be intuited? Or no, I mean, he's not saying that. That's clearly just the wrong interpretation. I'm making a joke, but
are there any other circular reasoning with God being the ultimate foundation of reality, that is not invalid. Are there any other
It's
kinds of
unavoidable by the nature of the system itself.
okay, so it's not invalid. Are there any other kinds of circular reasoning apart from God that have nothing to do with God that are also not invalid?
Yeah,
that
sure.
are
The
valid?
categories themselves have to be presupposed for the possibility of knowledge. So, in other words, the way I make the argument is just simply that knowledge presupposes the categories. The categories themselves are grounded in God.
Okay, so the categories themselves, their foundation.
Okay, so now remember Trent's dilemma, which was either you're just you can tell me your conclusion, or you're going to provide me with reasons. If you tell me your conclusion, you're begging the question. If you provide me with reasons, then you're doing natural theology. Well, what did Jay just do?
Knowledge presupposes the presupposed for the possibility of
Nothing to do with God that are also not invalid.
yeah,
that
sure.
are
The
valid.
categories
Listen to this.
themselves have to be presupposed for
Categories have to be presupposed
the possibility of
for the
knowledge. So, in
possibility
other
of
words, the
knowledge.
way I make the argument is just simply that
The way I make the argument, so that's an admission of this engagement in natural theology.
knowledge presupposes the categories. The categories themselves are grounded in God.
That's an argument. That's an argument about necessary conditions for things.
Okay, so the categories themselves, their foundation is not circular. Their foundation is in God.
Well, they're circular when we're considering whether we can justify them at the human level.
Right. So we can't say that logic is true because the laws of logic themselves show that they're true. It sounds like you're saying
That's circular.
Yeah,
Right.
it sounds like you're saying circular reasoning is invalid, except when we're talking about God being the foundation of the universe.
I'm saying that every system at root is circular, and that's what I'm demonstrating to you in your strong foundationalism. And I'm showing that that's not going to be then how we justify or explain the different systems themselves. It's a comparison of systems and not a comparison of evidences.
Mm-hmm. But then I think, well, I don't want to actually, I feel unfair. I shouldn't ask you questions. This is your time.
It's a comparison of systems, right? But if he were doing, if that was what he meant, that would be different from his presuppositionalism. Because if we're doing a comparison of systems, then we would have to be able to appeal to some theoretical virtues which were taken as givens. So those theoretical virtues themselves would have to be, not stance dependent, because it would have to be the case that by comparing theories for any people with any set of beliefs, that they would be able to see by the virtues, unless they were just wrong, right? But if they're going to be correct, then they would have to be able to see by the virtues that the system was superior. So how is this just not a standard natural theology argument that Jay's offering?
Time, we can do whatever you want.
Well, let me move on to another issue, which was in the.
'Cause I have a lot of questions of my own, but it's your
That's fine. So you did ask me to go through different points that I haven't addressed, and not just because of time. It wasn't because I was trying to avoid any of the points that you made. But again, I think that a lot of what you said, again, I understand that you're attempting to say that, well, we can say that God's personal, but what I want to know is, do you think there's a generic conception of person that doesn't reference the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit?
A generic conception of person that doesn't reference. I think most people's conception of person doesn't reference the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, unless you are a Christian who has unless you have the belief that persons are made in the image of God. For anyone who doesn't have that belief, then they're not going to believe. I mean, in a sense, that's just obvious, because it's like saying, but yeah, it's just saying, there are some people who believe it and some who don't. But yeah, there are some who believe it and some who don't. Now, obviously, if you believe it, then you're going to think that the people who say that they don't believe it do actually believe it. They just don't know they believe it, right? But it doesn't seem to be a part of most people's conception of personhood. So why is Jay asserting this like it's this just ridiculous thing to disagree with? Well, I guess because he believes it is.
I think that one can believe, well, here's the problem. There are a lot of different natural theologies. I don't believe God is a person because I'm a classical theist. There are others who hold that view. But I think that we can talk about God in being and something that is shared among the three persons of the Trinity, that God is not a person, but he has personal qualities. God is intellect. God has will. And so that is something shared by the three members of the Trinity. And that's something we can know: intellect, will, moral goodness. We can get that from natural theological arguments.
So it doesn't. So it's not an appeal to person. It's not an appeal to Father.
It's not an appeal to the Father himself, the one that's particular member.
That's my
of the Trinity.
point, is that in the Trinitarian theology developed in the councils, there's no such thing as personhood apart from Father, Son, and Spirit.
Well, whatever I say that is true of God, at least true of the divine nature, is also going to be true of the persons, minus special revelation. So if I say God is eternal, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all eternal. The other attributes will follow.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the specific development of the notion of person and hypostasis and how unique it is to the early church and her revelation. It's not a doctrine that comes out of paganism.
Right, but person, the term person, like apostasies and prosopon, their meaning changes over the centuries, how they're used among different philosophers.
Exactly.
So,
Agreed.
like Aquinas, when he talks, when we talk about the Trinity being three persons, we don't believe that God is a person like you or me, that it's an analogical term that best describes these relations that exist within the Godhead.
Yeah, I'm
But
just making the.
they're not persons like us.
I didn't say that they were. I'm just
Mhm.
making the point that the development of the notion of person in the definitions of the Trinity in terms of who God is. I mean, the Creed says, I believe in one God, the Father. So it actually identifies the unity, the oneness of God with the hypostasis of the Father, and by extension, the nature that he communicates to the Son and to the Spirit.
But then
by
we'd also
generating
say the
procedure.
Son and the Holy Spirit are equally divine, though.
Yeah,
All right,
but
I'm gonna have to step in
not
right here
equivalent.
because the time is up. But I'll let Trent Horn do the eight minutes of cross examination now. And for those of you who are watching online, this would be the time to start sending in your questions that you'd want to ask either Jay or Trent. And so please include who you're addressing your question to, whether it's Trent, Jay, or both of them. And so once again, during this 8-minute session, this is the time to start sending in your questions in the chat. With that, I'll step out, and Trent, as soon as you start talking, I'll start my timer.
I have one question before you start to use one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
What is the Q&A then closing statements, or what's the order?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to do 30-minute Q&A with the audience, and so I'll be fielding the questions, and then after that, we'll close with 5-minute closing statements.
Okay.
All right, Trent, whenever you start talking, I'll start my timer.
All righty. All right, so I have a few questions for you, Jay. Has any ecumenical council ever condemned natural theology?
If by natural theology, what you mean in the Thomistic scheme, yes.
I'm just talking about the proposition of man by human reason can come to know God exists.
Yeah, but again, I didn't agree that there was a generic notion of those things, or that there's an obvious, clear example of what natural theology is. In fact, my whole point was to debate the nuances of it and point out that I affirm natural revelation. I mean different things by the terms.
Sure. Then whatever the term means, even if it's a different meaning of the term, is there an ecumenical council that's condemned?
If we forget what the term means completely, so as it just means nothing.
Natural theology?
I would say that if you get to the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the implications of their iconographic teaching of reality, which basically identifies the notion of the logi in terms of the world being a book or an icon of Christ, I would say it's implied there, but it's not explicitly going to say in an anachronistic way that we condemn the Thomistic doctrine of theology.
Okay. Does the Bible ever condemn using reason to know God exists?
No, and in fact, I don't believe that there's any dearth of evidence. I think the reason itself can be used as a transcendental argument to prove God.
Okay. I want to talk about the presuppositions a bit because I think that you and I both agree it's important to demonstrate to people that God exists. Because I mean, there are people. Do you believe there are people who don't believe, and obviously who don't believe in Christianity, right?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, and it's important for us to present evidences to them to demonstrate to them the truth of Christianity.
Absolutely.
Okay, then I'm really, really super curious how you would do that. That if you can't start with self-evident truths and reason up from the created order to the creator, tease out attributes from arguments, but you have to use a big circular argument. Why presuppose the God of Orthodox Christian faith instead of any of the other numerous examples I gave in my opening statement?
Well, because I think that ultimately philosophy shows us that what's at work here in the dispute between an atheist or a Christian or unbeliever is paradigms and not pieces of evidence, because evidences are interpreted according to, in my view, worldviews and paradigms. And this comes to the fore in modern debates following Kant and Hume. So we wouldn't see this in the ancient writers per se, because it's not a question that's raised in the ancient writers. I mean, there's many examples of things that I could say weren't raised in the 1st to 6th centuries that are raised in the 7th to 9th centuries. We wouldn't conclude that because they weren't raised, they were false, or they weren't the case, or they weren't true at that time. They just weren't raised as questions. But there are indicators of presuppositional types of argumentation, including St. John Damascus, Fountain Knowledge Book 1, where he uses a transcendental type of argument to refute sophists, which he gets from Aristotle.
Right. But well, Jay, I'm actually not necessarily opposed to using logic.
Like, why was he mentioning all of those things to make? I don't know. It's so difficult to even follow the thread of the point that he's making because there's so much superfluous information.
Types of argumentation, including St. John Damascus, Fountain Knowledge Book 1, where he uses a transcendental type of argument to refute sophists, which he gets from Aristotle.
Right. But well, Jay, I'm actually not necessarily opposed to using logic, knowledge, or morality to show God exists, or even a kind of transcendental argument. My concern is the specificity of the presupposition, because your case seemed to be very negative to natural theology, its inability to prove a rigid designator, the triune God of Christianity.
No, I do. All right, I agree.
So my question for you is, what would prevent? Why couldn't I take your exact same presuppositionalism?
The problem is the triune God is a description. That's not. Oh, is it a name? like well, it depends if that God exists necessarily, doesn't it? It depends if the referent necessarily exists, then it does exist in all possible worlds. But let's think. So Yahweh is the triune God in the actual world. Yeah, but well, this is what I don't get about Jay's use of these terms like intentional and rigid and flaccid for if you're in the mood, or non-rigid designators if you're not. I mean, for him, the kind of terms that he's saying that people are equivocating on, well, he's not saying people are equivocating on, the kind of terms he's saying are non-rigid, but he does believe that God is a name, right? And the object that answers to that name exists necessarily in all possible worlds. So there's no possible worlds in which God is not the triune God, right? So all the descriptions and properties of God are satisfied in every possible world. So God is a rigid designator. Is God I guess God can, but then God can also be used in an equivocal sense to mean something else. So what does the rigid designator discourse really add? If God is used in the sense where it means the Christian God, then it is a rigid designator. I don't know. It's just a rabbit hole that doesn't seem useful.
Right.
Swap out the God of Orthodox Christian faith, put in the Catholic divine simplicity God,
Right.
or Cornelius Van Til taking his Protestant view of God, using the same argument. What breaks the symmetry to pick your presupposition over the others?
Because in this case, the way I would make the argument is that the Trinity is actually the ground, not just of epistemology or logic or things like that, but actually the entire paradigm. In other words, it's an argument for the entirety of the Christian paradigm, not merely an argument for this or that piece of it. So the Trinity comes with, in terms of Orthodox theology, as I understand it, St. Maximus's grand metaphysic, it actually comes with a holistic epistemology and metaphysic that is the grounding of the natural world itself. So it's not just an argument for an abstract concept or some logical thing. It's the entire Christian paradigm and the metaphysics of the Trinitarian theology that we have as Orthodox, which is unique to us. And this is why, one last point, this is why in, for example, Questions and Doubts, St. Maximus goes to great lengths to show that there are natural proofs for the Trinity. He actually thinks the existence of the world, the modal existence of the world itself, is triadic and is a proof, not an adumbration or a trace, but an actual proof of the Trinity.
Okay, but why? I didn't hear a reason. Why is our presupposition going to be a Trinity versus a Unitarian God?
Oh, I see.
Why?
Right.
That's point one. And point two, why your concept of the Trinity as opposed to a Catholic or Protestant concept? Why?
Well, because first of all, the triune God is not just posited. I'm actually saying that God and the Christian worldview and the Christian Orthodox paradigm gives an account for the metaphysical problems, for the one and the many, for the universals, for the logical categories, the Aristotelian categories that Maximus basically squishes into natural contemplation. I'm saying that the structure of the world, as well as ethics, metaphysics, epistemology, all of that is justified, given an account for, and grounded in a specific triune God and the specific revelation of what he says about how the world's constructed. So it's a revelatory theism and a justification by revelation, as opposed to autonomous, the unaided reasoning approach that you're defending.
So you're saying that we should presuppose the God of Eastern Orthodox Christian theism.
Correct.
Because the God of Eastern Orthodox Christian theism has revealed we ought to presuppose him.
No, I'm saying that we should presuppose him precisely because the self-revelatory declaration gives an account for the problems of ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology that I keep raising.
Why is it
Christian worldview solves those problems?
Why does only Orthodox Christian? So I guess what I'm trying to figure out
because of the unique revelatory character of the Trinity in Orthodox Christianity.
Right, but Protestants and Catholics also believe in the Trinity.
Yeah, but you don't have it because you have heterodox versions of it. I'm not personally attacking you, but I'm saying
that's fine. But it's okay. So we would say your conception of theism is the only one that explains reality, because we would deploy arguments of reason to show that the competitors are false or don't succeed.
Correct, but that's a category error. But because I'm using arguments from reason doesn't mean that they have logical or epistemic or ontological priority. That's a category error that Thomists constantly make. That because I'm using an argument, that it therefore has epistemic or ontological priority, or that I use it first in a chain.
Okay.
And that's what I'm saying. It doesn't
Would
follow.
this also include? We only got a few seconds here. My question earlier: Did Abraham believe God? Do you think Abraham had an explicit knowledge of the Trinity?
Yes, and St. Maximus says he did.
Okay, so he knew the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. All right. Last one here. Do you think it's helpful to offer evidence for specific historical doctrines like the resurrection? Like,
Absolutely, there is definitely a place for evidences, and
Okay.
yes, that's part of the task of apologetics. In fact, I believe there's nothing but evidence for Christianity.
Okay, and then it can be helpful to offer maybe an argument. So we could show God exists maybe from a miracle that's occurred.
Well, I would say
Like maybe the miracle of fire for Eastern Orthodoxy.
so. I believe that miracles can attest to the position. I don't think that they quote prove it. And,
All right,
I would
thank
say,
you.
and I would say, as proof of that, when Jesus is responding to the guy in torments, he says, "Let me come back and warn my brothers." Jesus says, "Even though one rise from the dead, they will not believe because they have Moses and the prophets." So, yeah, I mean, I utilize messianic prophecies all the time to as part of the apologetic. Sure.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to get started now with the 30 minutes of just audience Q&A. And so let me get my timer ready. So let's begin.
Okay, I'll see if I can get through all of this, but I don't know how much more I've got left in me. But
With Luke.
I suppose to just pause before the Q&A continues. I think it's clear that Trent has made a far more coherent case thus far. In the opening statements, it wasn't clear what Jay's argument was at all, really, whereas Trent did positively put forward his case. In the cross-examinations, again, I think that Trent had good answers to everything Jay said, except maybe the foundationalism, right? There might be some problems for Trent's foundationalism, but I think that's a little bit aside from the point from the main point of the debate. Whereas Jay, mostly, I'm not sure he did have response. In fact, I think when Jay did reluctantly, like drawing blood from a stone in some cases, answer the questions that Trent had, he answered in ways which seemed to contradict some of the sort of positions he was articulating at certain points as well.
Meister, he says to Trent, "How can you say Abraham didn't believe the Trinity? We assume he doesn't have articulation of it, the articulation of it that we do now, but he experienced / believes the same Trinity we do now."
Amen.
Well, what I would say is, where does the Bible record Abraham having an interaction with and knowing the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? I know there's a typology of the three visitors that visit Abraham is a typological reference to the Trinity, but that's far different from the knowledge of the Trinity you and I have of understanding Father, Son, Holy Spirit, eternal generation, eternal spiration, or of course the different Catholic Orthodox views on that. I think I would say just it's very clear. Was the knowledge of the Trinity among people who believed in God equal before and after the time of Christ? If you say that it was equal, I would say that historically and theologically that makes no sense at all until the doctrine of the Trinity was revealed through the incarnation.
All right, Jay, would you like to respond?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is a great example of how there's a fundamental difference between us, because Trent's presuppositions are that there was not knowledge of the Trinity in an implicit form in these cases. Of course, fundamental Orthodox theology is that the theophanies are the person of Christ, they're the second person of Logos. This is unanimously the teaching of the early church fathers until Augustine begins to question it on the Trinity, I think book 3. And the fact that it's the Logos and that is so stressed in Orthodox theology and iconography shows that we've maintained this very point, which is crucial, which is that there is no generic God. Even in the Old Testament, there's no bare Unitarianism. It was always the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, which is consistently revealed all throughout the Old Testament. Have multiple talks going through the theophanies and the Trinity in the Old Testament. Orthodox,
That's interesting, because earlier in the discussion, Jay said, but the Bible does use God to mean different things. But now he's saying it always means the Father.
Iconography in regard to the Rublev icon, for example, is there precisely to stress this point. And ironically, Trent's own theologians, in regard to, if he was, I would say, if he were to go argue with a Muslim, I mean, this would be where you needed to go, because St. Justin Martyr makes these arguments against Trifather Jew to say it's the Trinity in the Old Testament, and it's not a matter of whether the word Trinity is used, because the New Testament doesn't use the word Trinity, but we all know the Trinity is revealed. This is why St. Maximus says the Old Testament patriarchs all had a direct noetic perception of the Trinity. And this is why Jesus says, Abraham believed and rejoiced to see me.
All right, the next question I have here is from Dro Meme Replies, and he says to Jay, "How do you justify one presupposed system over another?"
By a comparison of the systems in terms of the internal critique, to see which systems can give an account for the basic presuppositions of knowledge, epistemology, and metaphysics. Excuse me.
But he's assuming, given that there are standards by which those things can be compared, right? Which is the very thing that he's saying is problematic for someone like Trent's natural theology, that he's assuming certain givens.
Epistemology, ethics, and metaphysics. And so if the various systems are unable to account for those basic presuppositions in terms of the categories, for example, then those systems make knowledge impossible. And so thus Christianity emerges as the only system or paradigm that gives an account for and makes knowledge possible. And I didn't get a chance to respond to Trent's other point. I'm not going to do it right now, but the Unitarian deity and the dyad deity have such internal presuppositional problems that they make knowledge impossible.
Yeah, Trent, do you have a response?
Yeah, I would just say that what Jay is doing is just natural theology in reverse. So he's starting with the conclusion of the triune God of Eastern Orthodoxy, identifying these elements of the world that need to be explained, and then showing why alternatives, whether it's atheistic, polytheistic, non-Christian, or non-Orthodox, don't get the job done. And that's kind of what I do. I just do it in a forward direction. I start with what we observe, show that nothing can explain this except for the religion that I'm a part of. So I don't disagree with what he's doing. I just really believe it's just natural theology in a reverse direction, because he's using arguments to select between presuppositions. If he doesn't do that, then it becomes circular reasoning.
All right, the next question I have here is from My Name is Jeff. This is for Trent. So does your natural theology presuppose analogia entis, that God is supreme being in the chain of being? How does this accord with the Father's teaching that God is hyperousios?
And by the way, I didn't mean to laugh at the person's question. I'm hoping that's a reference to 22 Jump Street, which is a movie I thoroughly enjoy. Because I watch it on planes like all the time when I travel. Yeah, I think I would need to hear more about what the person means by the Eastern view of hyperousios. I would say analogia entis, or chain of being. I would say that God is, I would affirm the essence, existence distinction. And the analogy of being, that when we describe God and talk about God, we speak not in a univocal way, but not in an equivocal way. We always have to use analogous ways of talking about God. While creatures participate in being, only God himself just is being. I know Catholics and Orthodox differ on some of the finer points of understanding the inner life of God, but I think we both agree on the core concept that God and the world are radically different. God is creator, we are creature, infinite gap between the two. Though we can see from the finite world there is this infinite creator.
Yeah, and Jay, if you want to say anything, just feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I think that's a great question from Jeff. And I would just respond by saying that, unless I misheard, it sounded like Trent said that he affirms the essence existence distinction, but that's exactly what Actus Purus is intended to deny. There is no distinction in God between essence and existence. He is pure act.
Yeah, I agree with that. I must have misspoke. I agree with the distinction, but not in God, but in other things.
All right, so this next question is from Pudis Spencer. This is for Jay. He says, how do you know your deity is not actively deceiving you? 2 Thessalonians 2:11, in your system's claimed revelation for morally sufficient reasons.
Right. So these kinds of logic puzzles or traps that we might see in like a philosophy 101 class, or like a
Notice how before he answers it, the first thing he does is to ad hominem the person. This is the kind of question that would come out of a philosophy 101 class. It's like, is that being meek?
These kinds of logic puzzles or traps that we might see in like a philosophy 101 class, or like a Descartes' evil demon example, is precisely one way that I could go about refuting that is pointing out that it would make knowledge impossible, right?
It would make knowledge, well, maybe not. That knowledge could be possible, but God could just be deceiving you, Jay.
In other words, I wouldn't have
everyone else has knowledge that you're wrong, but he's just deceiving you.
A way to delineate between the true and the false if all reality was essentially fundamentally deceptive in nature. So if there's no place for me to have a reference to objective truth, then there wouldn't be a way for me.
And is Jay making an argument here for foundationalism? That's
delineate between anything true or false. And so now all knowledge, all predication, all delineation would actually be impossible. So I would say by the impossibility of the contrary, that would be an impossible worldview to accept or to hold.
Yeah, Trent, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what I would say is that line of argument of arguing that it's impossible based on God having a certain kind of standard, I think that it's valid, though once again, it shares a lot of arguments with natural theology. On my own premise, I would say that if we see God, the moral argument shows God is the standard of goodness. The argument of promotion shows that God is actus purus, or he is infinite being itself without any potentiality. As such, you would not have any deficiencies or absences. Evil is a privation. So if God has no privation, then he couldn't possibly be evil. And as a result, he would just be goodness itself. And so he can never act contrary to goodness. And lying is always contrary to the truth. And we can discuss the question of the morality of lying, but I would say that God being goodness itself would not actively engage in the sin of lying for greater utilitarian purposes from man's perspective.
Okay, so I saw a question on further back in the chat, but this is from, I can't pull up the question on this screen, but on another one. This is from Ayush Manocha, and he says, for Trent, if we start our theology by reasoning from sense data of the natural world, shouldn't all the death we see around us cause us to conclude death is natural?
I've heard this argument before, and just...
Okay, I think maybe I'll just finish out this question. But
because we start with our sense data, it doesn't follow that we should end there. If we just look at the world around us, we couldn't determine if the creator was good or evil. All of the arguments for natural theology have to be put together. From them, we see that God is perfect goodness itself. And because of that, we can know God must have a morally sufficient reason for allowing evil. I will say, though, that death, whether it's natural or not, the Bible is very clear that God gave Adam and Eve green plants in the garden to eat. So there was death prior to the fall when man invented the salad. So, and Aquinas affirmed even that the animals would have still had their predatory ways.
Jay's really not happy with that.
The Bible seems to make it very clear when you look at Romans, and what it's talking about is that death and human death entered at the fall, not death in general. Otherwise, you couldn't have had entropy. You couldn't have had the plants in the garden to eat. Human death entered at the fall. But we do believe in things like Romans 8 that God will ultimately bring us out from this world itself to something even greater to redeem creation. So in one sense, non-human death is a part of the finite world, but God will redeem it and make it even better in the new earth and the new heavens.
Look, it's like getting ready to beat him up or something.
Non-human death is a part of the finite world, but God will redeem it and make it even better in the new earth and the new heavens.
Yeah, I would fundamentally totally disagree with that assessment. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 15:26, Paul says death is the enemy. So for the Orthodox Church, it is fundamental, especially if you read Deification of Man by Panagiotis Nellis, who is a famous critic and rejecter of natural theology, by the way, that death will be destroyed. And so if death is natural in any sense, it doesn't really make sense to say that death could be destroyed. In fact, animal death, I don't believe existed before the fall, precisely because if you look at Romans 8, the cosmic scope of the redemption that Christ brings in terms of what's fundamental to orthodoxy and what's called the recapitulation doctrine, which is basically missing in Roman Catholic theology. Maximus and the Council's recapitulation doctrine is a fundamental acceptance that all death, whether physical or spiritual, is a result of Adam's fall. And I would direct those that are interested, and this is the Father Seraphim Rose's great classic big fat book, demonstrates this in about 1,000 pages, that this is the unanimous position of the Church Fathers, as well as, by the way, especially for those that are interested in the Sixth Ecumenical Council, St. Sophronius' confession, which is accepted as a dogmatic statement of the Sixth Council, agrees with us. It affirms six-day creation. And Trollo Canon 109, which is accepted at the Seventh Ecumenical Council.
Yeah, this is actually something that I do find rather off-putting about Eastern Orthodoxy, is it seems like there's more of a prevalence towards sort of like young earth creationism and sort of like what I would view as maybe untenable positions about stuff that's happening in the Old Testament.
Condemns those that believe that death existed before the fall.
All right, the next question I have here is from PJQ23. He says, Trent, do you grant a distinction between vicious and virtuous circularity underlying any system of knowledge?
No, I believe that's an ad hoc demonstration that has been created. In fact, the vicious virtuous circularity comes from modern presuppositionalists like Cornelius Van Til, John Frame. I don't believe that there are any other logical fallacies where you have a virtuous version of it or a vicious version of the fallacy. The reasoning is either sound or it's not sound. And what I think I made very clear in discussing with Jay is that he agrees you can't justify the existence of anything, not even transcendentals like the laws of logic, through circular reasoning. He would reject the view logic explains itself. But he's trying to apply this only to God. And that leads us to the problem then of which presupposition do you choose, which not. And either you use arguments to pick one presupposition over the other, which is natural theology, or you just pick the one that happens to be your religion and it's special pleading and it's circular reasoning as a result. So no, I don't believe that if you need to reason in a circle, P, Q, R, T, P, you don't need to use that reasoning. You can just start with P. P, therefore P. Circular reasoning is unnecessary. You can just say the thing is true because the thing is true. And then that actually gets you to a kind of foundationalism that Jay was against tonight.
Well, again, Trent's not understanding what presuppositionalist and transcendental argumentation is actually attempting to do. He's merely restating his position. And in fact, the whole point, as I said earlier, was that it's a metalogical question, which Trent just seems to reply as if you solve a metalogical question with logic. It's a metalogical question, meaning it's prior to the doing of logic. That's why it's a more foundational paradigm.
Again, that's kind of strange. It's a metalogical question is prior to the doing of logic. What does he mean by prior? Like it's logically prior, it's chronologically prior? You know, like I definitely used logic before I did anything, had any beliefs about metalogic.
Paradigm level question. And until Trent sees that, I don't think he's going to understand the argument that's being made. And my whole point in drilling down into his strong foundationalism that he affirmed earlier was to show that his own position was precisely circular.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with the vicious and virtuous circularity. I think it's just begging the question, whichever way you cut it. Anyway, yeah, that is me done. I agree. Something about the way Trent Horn speaks makes me think he's quite intellectually honest. I think that that's right. I do think a ton of arguments around the definition are question begging. I'm not sure if you mean like ontological arguments and stuff or something else. Okay, well, thank you everyone for watching. Someone did ask me if I could do a review of that debate, so I thought I'd do it at some point, and I have. So thank you for watching, and yeah, I don't know what will be next on the channel, but we'll see. Thanks.